Hey, the ranger said it was the whistle that bothered him most. Not the missing hiker, not the blood on the trail marker. The whistle, because it was the exact same 3-beat pattern the Park Service uses for a distress signal, and it was coming from a canyon where, by his own calculation, nobody could have survived the night. He knew the protocol. 3 short blasts, a pause, 3 more. You learn it in your first season, and you never forget it. He filed a report. Nobody followed up. He transferred out of that district the following spring. To understand why that whistle was wrong, you have to go back to the morning the call first came in. Denny had been a ranger for 12 years by that October, long enough that most of the work had stopped feeling like work. Post-storm patrol was the kind of thing you did on autopilot. Coffee from the gas station in Harlan. Thermos wedged between the seat and the door. Clipboard on the passenger seat with the trail log already half filled from yesterday's damage notes. His rain jacket was still damp from the day before. He hadn't bothered hanging it to dry because the forecast said more rain by afternoon, and there was no point. He'd worked that canyon section enough times to know which culverts failed first after a heavy rain, which sections of trail turned to soup before the others, which markers sat low enough that floodwater knocked them sideways. The storm had come through 2 nights before. Not a disaster, but a serious one. 4 inches in 6 hours, which in that part of the southern Appalachians means the hollows fill fast and the creek crossings get ugly. Denny had already called for a formal closure on the canyon trail before the storm even peaked. He'd stood at the trailhead the morning of and posted the signs himself. Trail closed, flood damage, no entry. He'd zip-tied the sign to the post, tested it, driven away. Now he was back to check the damage and confirm the closure signs were holding. He parked at the trailhead just before 8 in the morning. The mud was fresh and dark, the color of river clay, and his boots sank a 1/4 inch with each step. He noted that automatically, boot depth as a rough measure of soil saturation, the kind of practical habit you build without ever deciding to. He clicked his radio, got the standard hiss, keyed it to give dispatch his location. The canyon walls would eat most of his signal once he went in, but that was normal. He did it anyway. That was when he noticed the trail register. The register was a metal box bolted to a post at the trailhead, the kind with a plastic sleeve over the paper log to keep the rain off. Denny opened it out of a habit, the same way he always did, just to check the dates. Most of the recent entries were from before the storm, day hikers and the occasional overnighter, all dated at least 4 days back. But the last entry wasn't 4 days back. It was dated yesterday. He read it twice. The date was correct, written in a neat hand that was clearly not hurried. The storm had been at its worst that day, running all afternoon into the evening, the kind of weather that keeps sensible people in their cars. The entry listed initials only, 2 letters, no last name, no emergency contact, no vehicle description. The destination line read, Canyon Overlook. Denny stood there for a moment. Trail registers had entries like this sometimes, people who filled them out at home, or filled them out before the weather turned and turned back before they ever made it down the trail. The initials only thing was unusual, but not prohibited. There was no rule that said you had to write your full name. Some people didn't trust it. He noted the entry on his clipboard, made a mental note to check if anyone had called in a missing person, and walked on. The service path that ran parallel to the closed canyon trail was in worse shape than he'd expected. A section of it had slid, not dramatically, just enough that the edge was uncertain. He stepped carefully, keeping to the high side, watching where he put his feet. The creek below was still running high, brown with sediment, moving faster than it looked. The canyon walls came up on both sides, and the sky narrowed to a gray strip overhead. The smell down there was specific. Wet clay and dead leaves and something that was almost mineral, like creek gravel when you turn it over in your hand. He was maybe half a mile in when he heard it. 3 short blasts. A pause. 3 more. He stopped walking. His first thought was that the wind was doing something funny with the drainage, pushing sound up from somewhere further down the creek. It happened in canyons. Sound moved in odd ways when the walls were close. He stood still and listened. 3 more blasts, same cadence, same pause. That was not wind. He keyed his radio, static. The canyon was eating it just like he knew it would. He tried twice more and got nothing useful. He stood at the edge of the service path with his coffee thermos in his hand and his clipboard under his arm, and he counted the seconds between sets of 3. And what bothered him, what he would think about later, driving home, and for months after that, was not the sound itself. It was the cadence. It was perfect. Whoever was doing it knew the pattern. 3 blasts, pause, 3 blasts. Not an approximation. The real thing. Then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. He waited a full 2 minutes. Nothing. Just the creek and the thin sound of wind somewhere above the canyon rim. He looked down the service path and then back the way he came. The decision he made in that moment was the decision a ranger makes. He could not hear it anymore, but someone had been making that sound from inside a closed canyon after a flood, and that was not a situation he could drive away from. He radioed his position one more time, knowing dispatch probably wasn't getting it, and started down. He took the service path slow, keeping his weight back on the downhill sections where the mud was soft enough to slide. The creek noise got louder as he descended. That particular roar that high water makes when it's moving through a narrow channel. Not a rushing sound exactly. More of a low, constant pressure, like the canyon itself was exhaling. He tried the radio twice more on the way down. Both times he got static with a faint pop somewhere underneath it, the ghost of a transmission from too far away to read. The canyon floor was worse than he'd expected. The flood had pushed debris across the service path. Branches, root balls, a section of split rail fence from somewhere upstream that had no business being there. The creek had receded enough to see the banks, but just barely. The waterline marks on the canyon walls were chest high in places. Whatever had been down here 2 nights ago had been underwater. That was the first thing that didn't fit. He found the campsite maybe 200 yards from the base of the service path, tucked into a shallow alcove in the canyon wall where the rock curved back enough to create a dry shelf above the floodline. Whoever had built that camp had known exactly where to put it. That was the second thing. You don't find a spot like that on a map. You find it by knowing the canyon. The sleeping bag was folded. That was what stopped him. Not rolled, the way you do it when you're packing up in a hurry. Folded. Lengthwise and then across, the way you fold a blanket to put it in a closet. It was sitting on the driest part of the rock shelf, set back from the edge, like someone had placed it there deliberately. The pack was leaned against the wall beside it, upright, not dropped. The boots, 1 pair, waterproof, well used, were set side by side on the ground with the toes pointed toward the canyon wall, like they'd been taken off at the door of a room and left neatly. They were still wet. The laces had been loosened. There were no food wrappers, no scattered gear, no signs of a hasty exit, no signs of panic, no signs of anything except a campsite that had been put away carefully by someone who had time to put it away carefully. Denny stood in the alcove for a long time. He photographed everything with his phone, the sleeping bag, the pack, the boots, the whole alcove from the entrance, the flood line on the walls above. He noted the flood line in his log. He noted that the sleeping bag and the pack were dry, which meant they had been above the water line during the storm, which meant either someone had been here during the worst of it and had set up in exactly the right place, or someone had come down after the water dropped and arranged this. He did not know which was worse. He was standing with his clipboard, writing the note about the boots, when he remembered what Earl had said. Earl was a trail volunteer, one of those retired men who showed up every season to help maintain the lower trail system. He'd been doing it for 11 years, knew that section of park the way some people know their own neighborhood. 2 weeks earlier, Denny and Earl had been out together marking the closure signs on a different section of trail, and Earl had said something that Denny had logged under the category of local color and mostly forgotten. "You know that canyon section?" Earl had said, not looking at Denny, working the staple gun on the signpost. Denny had said, yeah, he knew it. "You ever hear a whistle down in there?" Earl said. "Don't whistle back." "I know that sounds crazy, but don't." Denny had waited for more. Earl hadn't offered any. They'd finished the signs and driven back to the station, and Denny had not asked, and Earl had not explained. And that had been the end of it. Standing in the alcove with the folded sleeping bag and the side-by-side boots and no person anywhere in the canyon, Denny thought about that. He thought about the fact that he had not whistled back. He had heard the signal 3 times, confirmed it, and gone quiet. He didn't know if that mattered. He didn't know if Earl had meant anything specific, or was just carrying forward some old mountain habit that had been passed down from someone else. What he knew was that the sleeping bag was folded, and the boots were placed, and the person who had been here was gone. He almost missed the whistle entirely. He was turning to photograph the back wall of the alcove when the light caught it. A small glint of metal, eye level, hanging from a branch stub that jutted out of a crack in the canyon wall. It was tied there with a short length of orange paracord, the kind you buy at any outdoor store. A whistle. Stamped metal, the old style, with the seam down the middle and the small ball bearing inside. He knew that style. He had carried that style in his first 2 seasons before the Park Service switched to the newer plastic ones. They hadn't distributed that model in at least 8 years. It was swinging. Slightly, barely, but it was moving. There was no wind in the alcove. He stood there and watched it slow down, and he did not touch it. He photographed it from 3 angles. He noted in his log that it was approximately 6 inches from the wall, tied with orange paracord, standard knot, and that it was in motion when he found it. He noted the time. He did not note the swinging in his report. He didn't know how to note it in a way that would mean something to someone reading it later. He climbed back out of the canyon. On the way up, he checked the radio again, got a partial signal, gave dispatch his status. Campsite found. No occupant. Requesting a follow-up search team when available. That was all he said. He did not mention the whistle. He did not mention the way it was swinging. The follow-up team went in the next morning. 2 rangers and a trail volunteer. They found the alcove, confirmed the sleeping bag and the pack and the boots, photographed and logged everything Denny had already logged. Their report matched his on every detail. One detail was missing. The branch stub in the canyon wall was bare. The orange paracord was gone. The whistle was gone. Denny read their report at the station and went back to his desk and sat there for a while without doing anything. He knew what he'd photographed. He had the photos on his phone. 3 clear shots of an old-issue Park Service whistle tied to a branch in a closed canyon. He sent the photos to the district supervisor as part of his supplemental report. Nobody followed up on them specifically. The hiker turned up 2 days later. He came out at a trailhead 8 miles from the canyon, on the other side of the ridge, in the late afternoon. He was dehydrated and confused, but not seriously hurt. When rangers asked him about the canyon registration entry, he said he hadn't been near that trail. His initials didn't match the ones in the register. His handwriting didn't match. He had no memory of the canyon, no explanation for how his description might fit the equipment in the alcove, nothing that connected him to any of it. He had never been in the canyon. Denny transferred out of that district the following spring. He put in for a posting further north, gave the district a standard reason about career development, and left. Before he left, he went back to the trailhead one more time and stood at the register and looked at the entry. The neat initials in their careful hand. The destination listed as Canyon Overlook. The date during the worst of the storm. He does not whistle on patrol anymore. Not ever. If he needs to signal someone at distance, he uses the radio or he shouts. The rangers he works with now have noticed, and one of them asked him about it once, made a joke about it, and Denny just smiled and said it was a habit he'd picked up from a trail volunteer years back. He did not explain further. That account was submitted without a name attached. The person who corroborated it, a trail volunteer who had worked that district for 11 years, stopped answering emails the following winter. The next story comes from someone who was still on the job when it happened. She had been a ranger for 6 years when she pulled an overnight shift at a fire tower that should have been empty. Kara had done the fire tower rotation enough times that she'd stopped thinking of it as an overnight and started thinking of it as a long shift with a good view. The tower sat at the top of a 4-mile service road on the northern end of a state forest, accessible by one route in and the same route out, and in late August the drive up felt almost pleasant. The road cutting through dense pine, the temperature dropping a few degrees with every quarter-mile of elevation, the truck's headlights catching the moths that came out at dusk in small spinning clouds. She'd worked that tower 3 times before. She knew its sounds and its smells, and the specific way the observation cab creaked when the temperature changed at night. She was not nervous about it. She parked at the tower base at 8 in the evening, the sky still holding a narrow strip of orange along the ridgeline to the west. She checked the logbook first, the way she always did. A metal-covered binder bolted to a post at the base of the stairs, protected from rain by a plastic sleeve. Signed in, noted the time, wrote her name in the contact line. The logbook went back years, pages of neat entries from rangers and fire watch workers, some going back to seasons before Kara had joined the service. She did not read through it. She just signed her name and closed it. The climb was 60 feet of steel stairs, open on the sides, the kind that sway slightly in wind even when the wind is light. There was no wind that evening. The air was thick and warm and smelled of dry pine and something that might have been distant smoke, though the fire danger index for the district that week was moderate, nothing requiring active watch. This was protocol, not emergency. She climbed with her pack on her back and her flashlight in her hand out of habit, not necessity, because the last of the daylight was still enough to see by. The observation cab was a small square room at the top, windows on all 4 sides, a fixed base radio on the north-facing shelf, a small propane burner, a folding table, a chair, and a cot along the east wall. It smelled the way it always smelled. Old wood, pine sap, a little dust, the faint metal smell of the radio equipment. She set her pack down, checked the radio, logged her start time on the in-cab log sheet, and heated soup on the burner while the last of the daylight died outside the windows. By 9 o'clock, the ridgeline was black and the sky above it was full of stars. She sat with binoculars and swept the tree line in slow arcs the way she had been trained, looking for the orange glow that meant heat, the thin column that meant smoke. There was nothing. The forest sat still and dark below her, and the only light she could see was the faint yellow smear of a town somewhere to the east, too far to name. She drank her soup from the tin cup and listened to the radio hiss its quiet standby sound and felt genuinely fine. Around 11 o'clock, the stairs creaked. She heard it clearly. 2 short creaks from somewhere below the cab floor, the sound of weight on steel. She knew that sound. Old fire towers did it when the temperature dropped, the metal contracting as the night cooled, working its way through the frame in small pops and shifts. She had heard it before, on this exact tower. She noted it without alarm and went back to her binoculars. Then a third creak. Different pitch. Lower in the stairwell, which meant further down. And it had a quality the other 2 hadn't, a give and return. The specific flex of a step under weight that is distributed and then released. Temperature contraction didn't work that way. Temperature contraction was a single tick, not a press and release. She went to the cab door and opened it and shone her flashlight straight down the stairwell. The stairs were empty, all 60 feet of them, lit by her beam in sections as she swept it down, empty. The ground at the base of the tower was visible, the gravel pad, the logbook post, her truck parked beside it. Nothing moved. The service road stretched back into the pines and disappeared into dark. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, listening. Nothing. Large animal, she decided. Bear, maybe, brushing the base of the tower structure, or a deer walking through the gravel pad and knocking against a support strut. It happened. She'd had a bear investigate a tower base before, had heard it moving around below for 20 minutes before it lost interest. That was the rational explanation, and it fit, mostly. She closed the cab door and went back to her chair. 20 minutes later, she picked up the binoculars to do another sweep and looked down almost without thinking, the way you look out a window without meaning to, and the logbook at the base of the tower was open. She had closed it. She remembered closing it, the plastic cover, the heavy pages, the way the binder snapped shut when you pressed it. She remembered the specific sound of that snap because she'd been the one who'd done it. Now it was open, lying flat, the pages spread. She could not read it from 60 feet. She could see that it was open and that it had not been open when she climbed. She did not go back down to check. She told herself later that this was a professional calculation. She had no confirmed safety threat. She had heard an unexplained sound but seen nothing. The logbook being open was not an emergency, and going down the stairs into the dark on a maybe was not good protocol for a solo overnight. All of that was true. It was also true that something in her had made a decision before the professional reasoning caught up to it. She radioed dispatch, reported her position, reported nothing unusual, mentioned the temperature creaks as normal tower behavior. She did not mention the logbook. She sat with her back against the wall and her flashlight on, pointed at the stairwell opening, and she did not sleep. By midnight, she had cataloged everything she knew about her situation, and it was not comforting. 1 vehicle, hers, 1 access road, 4 miles of it, no turnoffs, no alternate route. 1 way up to the cab and 1 way down, 60 feet of open steel stairs that she could hear from anywhere in the room. If something had come up those stairs, she would hear it. She was certain of that. The creak on the lower step had been weight, not temperature. She was also certain of that, and the logbook had been closed when she climbed. She kept her flashlight on the stairwell opening, and she swept the windows every 20 minutes with her binoculars, and she did not find anything to look at except the dark. At 1:17 in the morning, the base radio spoke. Not static, not the pop and hiss of interference. A voice. Male, calm, low, speaking in a measured cadence that was not conversational. It was reading. A sequence of numbers, 7 digits, then a pause, then 4 more, the way coordinates are sometimes called out in a field transmission. It repeated once, exactly the same cadence, same pause between the sequences. Then the radio went back to its standby hiss. Kara sat with her tin cup halfway to her mouth and did not move for a moment. The base radio in a fire tower cab was a fixed unit, older equipment tied to the district's main frequency. It received. It did not reach out and produce voices at 1:17 in the morning without someone transmitting on that frequency. She knew that. She also knew that people transmitted on Park Service frequencies sometimes. Hunters with old equipment, hikers with radios they didn't know how to use, interference from other districts bleeding through on a clear night. All of that was possible. But the voice had not been fumbling with a radio it didn't understand. It had been calm, deliberate, reading numbers in the specific way someone reads numbers when they want the numbers to be accurate. She wrote the sequence down on the back of her log sheet. She wrote it twice to make sure she had it right. She did not transmit back. Whatever the instruction was about base radios after midnight, and she had not seen any such instruction, not yet. Something in the quality of that voice made her choose silence over response. She noted the time. She noted the frequency indicator. She did not sleep. Dawn came gray and slow, the ridgeline separating from the sky in a thin line of dark blue that widened into pale green, and then the washed-out white of an overcast morning. Kara had been awake for the full night. She was not prone to exaggeration about how she felt, but she was tired in a specific way. Not the tiredness of a long shift, but the tiredness of sustained alertness, of a body that had been ready for something all night and had not been able to stand down. She broke down her camp, packed her bag, and climbed down the stairs in the morning light. The stairs were ordinary in daylight. Steel, bolted, painted the green that Park Service structures are always painted, a little rust at the joints. She walked down them and stepped onto the gravel pad and turned to the logbook post. The logbook was closed. She stood there and looked at it. She had not gone down during the night. She was certain of that the way you are certain of things you have thought about carefully in the dark for 6 hours. The logbook had been open at roughly the 11:30 mark, visible from above with binoculars. Clearly open, the pages spread. Now it was closed, the plastic cover snapped, exactly as she had left it when she signed in. She opened it. The pages fell open naturally to an entry from 3 years earlier. Not her entry, which was at the back, the middle of the book, 3 years back, a short entry in handwriting she did not recognize. The ink was slightly faded, the kind of fading that comes from age and not from weather. The entry read, "Do not respond to the base radio after midnight. Protocol change, reason not listed." There was no name below it. No ranger identifier, no date beyond the season notation at the top of the page. She read it twice. She touched the page. It was damp. Not wet, not soaked, but damp the way paper gets when someone has touched it with hands that were recently cold and slightly wet. The dampness was in the center of the page, where a hand would rest if someone was holding the book open to that entry. The gravel around the post was undisturbed. The service road in both directions was smooth and unmarked. There were no tire tracks other than the twin lines her own truck had left when she drove in the evening before. She photographed the page. She photographed the road. She got in her truck and drove out. At the district station, she reported the radio transmission, gave dispatch the time, the frequency, the number sequence she had written down. A tech pulled the base unit the following week, ran a diagnostic, found nothing wrong with it. The frequency the transmission had come in on was not an active Park Service channel. It was close to 1. close enough that an older receiver might pick it up, but the channel itself had been decommissioned. Nobody in the district knew when it had been decommissioned or what it had been used for. The number sequence, when she mapped it, put a point on the western slope of the mountain, approximately half a mile from the tower base. That area had no trail, no structure, no reason for anyone to be. She noted it. She did not go look. The logbook entry was photographed and added to the district's records file. The district supervisor acknowledged it, said she would look into whether it reflected an actual protocol change that hadn't been properly documented. As far as Kara knew, that inquiry never produced anything. She never heard back. The entry sat in the file, in the handwriting of someone who had worked that tower at least 3 years earlier, telling whoever came after them not to do the thing that Kara, not having seen the entry, had already chosen not to do. She requested day shifts for the following season. Her supervisor approved it without asking why, which was either professional courtesy or the kind of not asking that happens when someone already knows the shape of the answer. 2 years later, Kara was put back on the fire tower rotation, and she did the daytime shifts without complaint. When the first overnight came up on the schedule, she called in sick. She had not been sick. She had gotten as far as the service road turnoff, sat in her truck with the engine running and turned around. She still works the district. She still does the tower. She has not done another overnight there since. The logbook entry is still in the file. The handwriting has never been matched to any ranger who worked that tower in the years surrounding the entry date. The coordinate point on the western slope has never been formally investigated. It sits on the map at the exact center of a search zone from a missing hiker case that was opened 5 years before Kara's shift and closed without resolution. The connection, if it is a connection, has never been noted in any official document. Kara noted it. She noted it to herself in her own records, the ones she keeps separate from the district files. She has not shared that observation with her supervisor. She is not sure what she would say. The next account was submitted by a man who spent one season as a seasonal ranger in a small Appalachian district before leaving the service entirely. He said it was not the job that made him leave. It was the trail. Marcus had the kind of enthusiasm for the job that people lose after their first real season, if they stay that long. He was 24, came from Columbus, had done enough weekend hiking to feel comfortable in the woods, but not enough to know what he didn't know. He'd applied for the seasonal position in February, gotten the posting in March, and driven down to the district in his Civic with a new pair of boots and a pack he'd owned for 2 years, but never taken further than a state park campground. He was not careless. He was just new in the specific way that careful people are new. He followed procedure, he took notes, he asked questions when he wasn't sure. What he didn't have yet was the knowledge that procedure doesn't cover everything. His assignment for that Tuesday in early April was a loop trail assessment. Hike the full 7 miles. Photograph and log any storm damage from the winter. Note missing or damaged trail markers. Check the 2 creek crossings for erosion. Standard early season work, the kind of task that gets handed to seasonals because it requires attention and endurance, but not much judgment. He signed the trailhead register at 8 in the morning, noted the date and his expected return time of early afternoon, and started up the trail in clean spring light. The forest was still waking up. The understory was bare enough to see through, the canopy not yet filled in, the trail surface soft from snowmelt and recent rain. He could smell it, that specific April smell of thawing ground and wet bark and something green just starting underneath the dead leaves. His boots left clear prints in the soft sections. He photographed the first damaged marker at mile 1 and the second at mile 1.8, logged both with GPS coordinates, noted the damage type and estimated repair priority. He was methodical about it, He was enjoying it, if he was honest. It felt like the job was supposed to feel. The first creek crossing was manageable, the water running clear and fast over the stones, maybe knee-deep at the center. He checked the bank erosion on both sides, photographed it, noted it, ate half a granola bar on the far bank sitting on a dry rock, watching the water move. He had a thermos of coffee in his pack that he was saving for the midpoint. Small pleasures. He adjusted his pack straps and kept moving. At what the map showed as mile 3.5, the trail reached a junction. Left fork went back toward the trailhead along the return leg of the loop, the shorter way home, for hikers who'd had enough. Right fork continued into the back half. A wooden junction marker post stood in the center, the kind with routed arrows pointing each direction. The wood treated and painted, but weathered at the corners. The arrow for the right fork, the one pointing forward into the back half of the loop, was facing the wrong way. Not slightly off. Fully reversed, pointing back the way he'd come rather than forward. He looked at it for a moment, then at his map, confirming what he already knew. He pulled out his field tools, reset the marker to the correct orientation, photographed it before and after, logged it. Trail markers got turned. Deer rubbed against the posts and spun them. Wind worked at them over winter. Sometimes hikers who were turned around moved them intentionally and made things worse for the next person. Correcting them was part of the job. He noted it and moved on. An hour later, he reached another junction. He almost walked past it before the post registered. He stopped and looked, and his first thought was that he had misread the map, that there was a second junction he hadn't noted, that the back half of the loop had a spur he'd missed in his pre-hike review. He pulled out the map. No second junction. He looked at the post. Same height, same treated wood, same painted arrows, same weathering at the corners. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken an hour earlier. It was the same post. Not similar, the same. He could see in the photograph the specific grain pattern on the left face of the post, a dark streak running diagonally from the top left corner. He could see that same streak on the post in front of him. He could see the small chip at the base of the right arrow where the paint had flaked. The same chip in the photo. He stood on the trail with his phone in one hand and his map in the other, and he took a breath and thought it through. Either he had walked in a circle he couldn't account for, covering the back half of the loop and returning to the junction without realizing it, which meant he had covered 3.5 miles with no memory of doing so. Or the trail had two identical junction markers, which was not possible. Not like this. Not with the same grain pattern and the same chip in the same place. He pulled up the GPS on his phone. The coordinates put him at a point that didn't match either the junction he'd left or any other marked point on the trail map. The GPS had signal. The signal was not reliable enough to trust. He took a photo of the post. He looked at both photos for a long time. He put his phone in his pocket and kept walking forward, reasoning the way a methodical person reasons. The loop must close somewhere ahead. The trail was a physical fact on the ground. His map was a document produced from that physical fact, and the two could not genuinely contradict each other. He would find the answer by continuing. He did not find the answer by continuing. By 2 in the afternoon, he had been walking for 6 hours. The trailhead was supposed to be 4 hours behind him, accounting for his stops and his pace on the soft ground. He had not passed it. He had not passed anything he recognized from the first half of the loop. Not the first creek crossing. Not the 2 damaged markers he'd photographed at miles 1 and 1.8. Not the dry rock where he'd eaten half a granola bar. The trail kept going. It looked like a trail was supposed to look in early April. Soft tread, bare understory, the occasional wet section where the snowmelt hadn't fully drained. It looked correct, it just didn't end. He stopped and sat on a fallen log and ate the rest of his food. He was not panicking. He made a deliberate choice not to panic, the way you make deliberate choices when you know that panic is the thing that turns a bad situation into a worse one. He drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold sometime around noon. He spread the map on his knee and looked at it for a long time, tracing every possible configuration of a 7-mile loop, trying to find any route that explained what his pace count was telling him. His pace count put him at somewhere between 12 and 13 miles. A 7-mile loop does not have 12 miles in it. Not by any geometry he could make work. He tried the radio, more static than signal, the ridge cutting off most of what the unit could reach. He tried 3 times and got a partial carrier tone and nothing useful. His phone showed no service, had shown no service for the last 2 hours, which was normal for that section of the district. He'd been told at orientation that the back half of the loop was a dead zone. He had noted it and not thought about it further at the time, because at orientation a cell dead zone is a practical fact and not a problem. Now it was a problem. The afternoon light was starting to go sideways, that specific late-day angle that comes when you have maybe 3 hours before dark in a forest and the shadows start to get ahead of themselves. He looked at the light and made a calculation. If he kept on the trail and the loop eventually closed, he would be fine. If the trail didn't close, and 12 miles of walking told him it might not, he would be on an unfamiliar trail section in the dark with a radio that wasn't reaching anyone. That was not acceptable. He was trying to decide between those 2 options when he came to the section of soft mud. It was a low spot in the trail, maybe 20 feet long, where the drainage from the slope above had pooled and not dried. The kind of section where you step carefully, choosing the firmer edges, trying not to post hole through to the wet clay underneath. He had been stepping carefully through mud all day. He looked down at the mud to find the best line and he saw his own boot prints. He recognized them immediately. His boots were a specific brand, a medium-weight hiker with a chevron tread pattern, and the prints were deep enough to show the full pattern clearly. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, the mud in the center still dark and wet, and they were going the same direction he was going now. Forward, not back toward the trailhead, not circling. Forward, moving in the exact direction he had been moving for the last hour. He stood at the edge of the mud section and looked at his own prints for a long time. There were 2 possibilities. The first was that he had been here before today, had walked this exact section in the same direction, and his boots matched another hiker's so precisely that he was misidentifying them. He rejected that one quickly. The tread pattern was specific. The depth matched his weight on soft ground. The stride length was his. The second possibility was that he had been here today, had walked this section already going this direction, and did not remember it. Not a gap, not a blur, a complete absence. He could not account for a single step of it. He thought about what Bet had said that morning. Bet was the permits clerk at the district ranger station, a woman in her late 50s who had worked that station for 20 years and who had the specific quality of long-tenured people in small offices. She knew everything about the place and offered most of it only when she decided you needed it. She had been at her desk when Marcus came in to pick up his assessment clipboard that morning, and she had said, without looking up from what she was doing, "Don't stop when you're tired on the back half of that loop. Just keep moving, even if something looks familiar." He had thought she was talking about trail fatigue, the way long loops get monotonous in the back half and your legs start lying to you about the distance. He had nodded and said he wouldn't, and taken his clipboard and left. Standing in front of his own boot prints going the wrong direction to make sense, he understood that she had not been talking about trail fatigue. He took a photograph of the prints. He looked at it next to the photograph of the junction marker post, and he put his phone in his pocket and he made his decision. He was not going to keep following the trail. He pulled out his compass, took a bearing due east, and stepped off the path into the understory. The brush was dense in places, open in others, the kind of mixed hardwood understory that a person can move through if they're willing to push. He pushed. He kept his compass bearing and he moved, and he did not look back at the trail. The slope went up before it went down, and for 20 minutes he was climbing through bare branches with wet leaves underfoot, and no trail and nothing to navigate by except the needle and the direction he'd chosen. Then the slope dropped and he could hear something ahead, the specific flat sound of a paved road, the way traffic noise sits differently from creek noise or wind noise. He came out of the tree line onto a road shoulder and stood there breathing. The park road. He recognized it. 2 lanes, cracked asphalt. The yellow center line faded to near invisibility. He was half a mile from the trailhead parking area. He could see it down the road, the small gravel pull-off, his truck sitting where he'd left it that morning. He walked to it on the road shoulder without going back into the woods. The trailhead register showed his sign-in from that morning. He checked it carefully, looking for any other entry from the day. There was none. He had been the only person on that trail. He drove back to the station and reported the marker issue and the GPS anomaly, which were field findings normal enough not to raise questions. He did not report the boot prints. He did not report the distance discrepancy. He wrote his assessment notes that evening at the station desk, and when he looked at the map one more time, tracing the loop with his finger, he could not find any configuration, any fold, any error, any misprint that gave the trail more miles than it was supposed to have. He requested a different trail assignment the next day, said he wanted broader experience across the district, which was true and also not the reason. His supervisor approved it without comment. He completed his seasonal contract, did good work, and did not return for a second season. He didn't tell anyone the full story until 2 years after he left the service. When he told it, the detail he kept coming back to was not the distance. It was the boot prints. The way the mud was still wet. The way his own stride looked, moving ahead of him in a direction he had no memory of choosing. The second seasonal worker who took a posting in that district the following year submitted a short note to the hiking forum where Marcus had eventually posted his account. She said she had assessed a different trail section, not the loop. She said her supervisor, not Bet had retired by then, had told her on her first day not to hike the loop alone, without giving a reason. She had asked why. He had said it was a safety policy she had not pushed further. The loop trail is still on the district map. The junction marker has been replaced since Marcus's season. The new one is properly oriented, facing the correct direction, and shows no signs of having been turned. The account after this one is shorter. The ranger who submitted it said there was not much to tell. Just one night on a patrol road, one thing she saw, and one reason she never drove that section alone again. Joe had 8 years on the job and no patience for drama about it. She was the kind of ranger who filed clean reports and kept her truck maintained, and did not call in favors or complaints unless something genuinely required it. She knew her patrol section the way a bus driver knows a route, the potholes, the bad curves, the spots where deer crossed at the same hour every evening. The East Fire Road was 12 miles of packed gravel through dense hardwood. No structures, no trailheads, no reason for civilians to be on it except the occasional hunter who'd found a way around the gate. She'd driven it 100 times. She knew every mile of it. The call came in at 9:30 that evening. Gate on the East Fire Road found open, reported by a county road crew that had been working a culvert repair nearby. Open gates on fire roads were not unusual and not emergencies. Hunters forced them. Kids with bolt cutters drove up looking for somewhere to drink. The old chains wore through and failed on their own. Protocol required a visual check and a re-close. Jo poured the last of the office coffee into her travel mug, got in her truck, and drove out. The fire road entrance was 6 miles from the station. She unlocked the outer gate at the highway end. That one was intact, which meant whatever had opened the gate further in had come from inside the road or had a key, and drove in on the gravel. Her window cracked an inch the way she always drove that section at night, listening. The hardwoods were thick on both sides, the canopy closing overhead so that her headlights lit a tunnel of gravel, and the dark pressed in on both sides. Country radio on low. Coffee in the cup holder. Her left arm on the windowsill. The night air coming in cold and smelling of wet leaves, and something faintly mineral from the creek that ran parallel to the road about 50 yards into the trees. She drove slowly on the fire road. Always did. The road had ruts she knew by position. A soft shoulder at the 4-mile mark where the drainage had undercut the edge. A section near mile 6 where the gravel had washed thin and the underlying clay came up slick after rain. Her headlights swept the tree line on the curves, catching the occasional eye shine of deer that watched from the edge and dissolved back into the dark when the light moved on. At the 2-mile mark, her headlights caught a figure on the right shoulder. Adult male, she assessed immediately, the way 8 years trains you to assess. Dark jacket, no hat, standing with his hands at his sides, facing the road, not walking, standing. She slowed and picked up her radio, gave the standard notation, checking on a subject, mile 2, East Fire Road, no plate to run, and pulled even with him. He was looking at the road, not at her truck, not at the headlights. She rolled to a stop. She looked at the space where he had been. The shoulder was empty. She had not looked away for more than 2 seconds. She had been watching him as she pulled up, had tracked him through the windshield and the driver's side window, and in the moment she shifted her attention to the radio and back, he was simply gone. No sound of footsteps, no crashing in the brush, no headlamp clicking on in the trees. She got out of the truck and shone her flashlight into the hardwoods on the right side of the road, called out a standard greeting, identified herself as Park Service. Nothing moved, no response. She swept the flashlight along the shoulder in both directions. The gravel was undisturbed. Late hunter coming out, she decided. Poacher, more likely, who didn't want to talk to a ranger. They could move fast and quiet when they needed to, especially if they knew the woods well enough, which anyone who'd hunted that section for years would. She noted the subject in her log, drove on. She found the open gate at the 9-mile mark. The chain had been unhooked from the post cleanly, not cut, not broken, just unhooked and left hanging. Someone with a key, or someone who knew the hook style well enough to work it in the dark. She drove through, checked the road beyond for vehicle tracks, found none, came back, closed and secured the chain, and started back out the way she'd come. At mile 7, her headlights caught the figure again, same shoulder, same side of the road, same dark jacket, same posture, hands at his sides facing the road. She was moving at the same speed she'd been moving on the way in, roughly 15 miles an hour on the rough gravel. She had covered 9 miles since mile 2, meaning the drive out to the gate and back. She had been inside this road for the better part of 45 minutes. A person on foot, moving on the road itself, could not have covered 9 miles of rough gravel in 45 minutes. She knew that. She did the math without deciding to do the math, the way you do arithmetic that your brain won't let you ignore. She stopped the truck this time, left the headlights on him. He didn't move. Stood in the exact posture she'd seen at mile 2, hands at his sides, face toward the road. She could not make out his face clearly at that distance. Her headlights were behind her, lighting him from the front, but 50 feet was 50 feet, and the face was in shadow under the dark jacket's collar. She keyed her radio and gave her position, noted the subject, kept her eyes on him while she transmitted. When she looked back from the radio, he was gone. No sound, no movement she had caught in peripheral vision. Gone the same way he'd been gone at mile 2, not retreating, not turning, just absent. She sat in the truck for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the radio still in her right hand. Then she put it in gear and drove on. She had her window up by the time she hit mile 8 and the radio louder than she needed it. A country station out of Knoxville that was mostly static on the bends, but came in clear on the straight sections. She would identify that later as the tell. She had turned the volume up before she consciously decided she was uneasy, the way the body makes adjustments the mind hasn't approved yet. She drove the straight sections faster than she should have on that road, and slowed on the curves because the curves required it, not because she wanted to. At mile 10, the figure was in the center of the road. She saw him in the headlights from 100 feet out and stood on the brake hard enough that the gravel shifted under the tires. The truck stopped at 50 feet of distance, and she left the headlights full on him and sat there with both hands on the wheel, and her foot still on the brake pedal. He was in the center of the road, not the shoulder, the center, straddling the faded yellow line, facing her headlights directly. Same dark jacket, no hat, hands at his sides. At 50 feet, her headlights should have lit his face clearly enough to read an expression, but the face was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. Not obscured, not shadowed, just not resolving the way a face resolves when light hits it at that distance. She stared at it, and it stayed unreadable, and she sat there for 30 seconds that felt like considerably longer. She hit the horn once. He did not react, no flinch, no turn of the head, no step back. Nothing changed. She waited another 30 seconds watching him, and he stood in the center of the road in her headlights and did not move and did not react, and the face stayed wrong. She hit the horn a second time, longer. Nothing. She reached for the door handle to roll her window down and call out, and in the moment she looked away from the windshield to find the handle. 1 second, maybe 2, she looked back up and the road was empty. 100 feet of gravel road lit by her headlights, the tree line on both sides, the center line running forward into the dark. Nothing in it. No shape, no shadow, no movement in the brush on either side. No sound she could hear over the radio she now turned down without thinking. She pulled the truck off to the narrow shoulder and put it in park and sat there for a few minutes. She was not the kind of person who talked herself out of things she had seen. She had seen the figure at mile 2, mile 7, and mile 10. She had been driving at roughly 15 miles per hour, and she knew the distance and she knew the time, and none of it worked. The mile 2 sighting and the mile 7 sighting were 5 miles apart, with perhaps 20 minutes of drive time between them. The mile 7 sighting and the mile 10 sighting were 3 miles apart, with 12 minutes of drive time. A person on foot on that road could not have made either of those gaps. A person in a vehicle would have needed headlights she would have seen, on a road with no turnoffs and no places to pull completely out of sight. She reviewed what she had. Dark jacket, no hat, hands at sides, facing the road each time, the same posture each time, which was the detail that bothered her most. People don't hold still that completely when a truck pulls up. They turn their head, they shift their weight, they do something. This figure had not done anything. At mile 10, it had stood in the center of the road with the vehicle's headlights on it and not reacted to the horn and not reacted to the light and the face had not resolved correctly at 50 feet in full headlight beam. She drove out. She did not stop again. She drove the last 2 miles at a speed that was too fast for that road, and she did not turn the radio back up. Back at the station, she sat in the truck in the parking lot for a moment before going in. She filed her report. Gate found open at mile 9. Chain unhooked, resecured. No vehicle access evident beyond gate. Subject observed at mile 2 inbound, possible hunter or trespasser. Subject not located on follow-up check. She did not include mile 7. She did not include mile 10. She was not certain why. The professional part of her understood that she had observed a subject twice on the same road, in positions that suggested impossible movement, and that this was worth documenting. A different part of her, the part that had turned the radio up before she knew she was scared, made the decision that some details needed to sit for a while before they went into a report. The next morning, she mentioned the figure to Dale. Dale had been at the district for 17 years, longer than anyone else currently on staff, long enough that he had a specific quality about him. He listened to things without performing surprise, the way people do when they've heard enough variations of a story that the new version doesn't shock them. She described what she'd seen, the posture, the dark jacket, the 3 locations, the math that didn't work. Dale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded, slow, the way he nodded when he was thinking rather than agreeing. "Don't shine your flashlight in their face if you see them on that road," he said, "and don't roll your window down." She asked why. "Because then they know you can see them." She waited for more. Dale looked at his coffee mug. He did not offer more, and she understood from the quality of the silence that asking again would not produce anything useful. He had said what he was going to say. She went back to her desk. It was writing the incident report, the full version, the one she kept in her own log rather than the official file, that produced the details she hadn't noticed in the moment. She was going through her radio log, pulling the times and positions for her notations, when she found the entries for mile 2 and mile 7. Both there, both logged with timestamps, her voice on the recording giving position and subject description. She scrolled to the section covering mile 10. The log skipped from mile 9.4, where she'd noted the road condition on the way out, to mile 10.6, where she'd noted the surface damage near the road edge. The mile 10 section was blank. No transmission. She sat with the log on her screen and went back through her memory of that moment. Pulling up, stopping at 50 feet, hitting the horn, reaching for the window handle. The figure gone, pulling off the road to sit. She had not radioed it in. She had been certain, in the moment, that she had keyed the radio when she stopped. She could feel the memory of it, the physical action of picking up the handset. But the log showed nothing. Her radio had been functioning all night. She'd made 6 other transmissions with no issue. The gap at mile 10 was not a malfunction. She kept the personal log entry. She filed the official report with the 2 sightings she'd already noted and left the 3rd one out, which meant her official record matched her radio log exactly and raised no questions. Nobody asked. Dale never brought it up again. She put in a standing request for a 2nd unit on night patrols for the East Fire Road section, citing animal activity and visibility concerns on the narrow shoulder. The request was approved within a week, no questions, as if it were the most natural thing. She has not driven that road alone after dark since. If she is ever on a night patrol on that section and she sees something on the shoulder, she does not shine her flashlight at it. She does not roll her window down. She has not told anyone why, except that once, to Dale, and Dale already knew. The next account comes from deeper in the backcountry. A search and rescue coordinator who worked the Appalachian backcountry for 14 years submitted this through a closed ranger network. She said she had never told it publicly because she was not sure anyone would believe the part about the child's voice. Lynn had run more missing persons searches in that district than anyone else on staff, which meant she had more experience than anyone else with the specific arithmetic of hope. How many hours made a warm case cold? How many square miles a team could cover before fatigue started producing errors? How a family's face changed between the first briefing and the third day. She was not sentimental about the work. Sentiment was a liability in SAR coordination. What she was precise. She trusted data over instinct, protocols over improvisation, and the specific knowledge of her team over anything she might feel in her gut. She had been running searches for 14 years, and she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it. And that professional confidence is important to understand, because what happened on the ridge that evening was not the experience of someone who scared easily or who filled in blanks with imagination. The search had gone well, by SAR standards. A day hiker, male, 53, had failed to return to the trailhead by the time his wife called it in. The search grid had been set at 4 in the afternoon, and by 6:30 a team on the north sector had located him, dehydrated, mildly hypothermic, sitting on a rock off-trail about 2 miles from where he'd intended to go. He was ambulatory. He was going to be fine. Lynn had gotten the confirmation on her radio and had begun the stand-down sequence, which was its own kind of work, accounting for every team member, logging their pull-out times, making sure nobody was still in the grid when the light failed. She was hiking out with the last 2 members of the tail team, a junior volunteer named Reyes and a second-season ranger named Price. They were on the ridge trail, heading south toward the trailhead, moving at the pace of tired people who know the hard part is over. Reyes was making a joke about the coffee at the staging area, which was genuinely terrible, and Price was laughing at it, and Lynn was half listening and half running the debrief in her head. The notes she'd need to write, the timeline she'd need to reconstruct, the call she'd need to make to the hiker's wife. Then she stopped walking. Reyes and Price went another 2 steps before they noticed and stopped too. The voice was uphill to the north, off the trail, somewhere in the trees above the ridge line. A child's voice. 2 words. Help me. The tone was flat. Not flat the way a frightened child goes flat after a long time of being frightened. Lynn knew that sound, had heard it twice in her career in genuinely terrible circumstances. This was flat from the start. Affectless. The words in the correct order with the correct meaning and none of the urgency that should have been behind them. Like a recording of the words rather than the words themselves. She held up her hand. Reyes and Price stopped completely. She keyed her radio and ran through the account status. All search subjects accounted for. 1, located, in transport. No additional subjects reported. She checked the trailhead log in her memory. No families with children had signed in that day. She asked dispatch to confirm. Any juvenile subjects reported in the district. Dispatch confirmed negative. The voice came again. Same 2 words, same flat tone, same direction, uphill and north, off trail, same distance, which meant it hadn't moved. Reyes took a step toward the tree line. Lynn caught his arm without looking at him. She called out, identified herself, asked for a name, asked the person to call back or whistle if they could hear her. Standard protocol, the words she had said dozens of times in situations that required them. The words went up into the trees, and the trees gave nothing back for a moment, and then the voice said, "Help me." 1 more time. Same cadence, same flat register, and stopped. Not faded into distance. Stopped the way a recording stops when someone lifts the needle. Lynn marked the GPS coordinate. She told Reyes and Price to stay on the trail, and she took 20 feet of slope into the trees, moving carefully, watching the ground. She spent 5 minutes in that area. She came back to the trail and told them to keep moving. She did not tell them what she had found in that area, which was nothing. No footprints in the soft slope, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that any person, child or adult, had been standing in or moving through that section of forest. The ground was soft enough from recent rain that her own boots left clear prints on the slope. Nothing else had. Price said, quietly, as they walked on, that the voice had sounded like it was coming from more than one place at once. Like it was distributed somehow, not sourced. Lynn did not respond to that. She logged the GPS coordinate, finished the hike out, processed the stand down, and wrote her report. The report did not include the voice. It included the successful location of the subject, the team pull-out times, and a note about soft trail conditions on the North Ridge requiring monitoring. Nothing else. She went back the next morning. She told dispatch she was doing a post-search environmental check, which was a real thing that SAR coordinators sometimes did after searches in sensitive areas, checking that the team's movement hadn't damaged anything that needed noting. She went alone, which was also not unusual for that kind of check. She hiked the ridge trail to the coordinates she'd marked and left the trail and climbed the slope to the area where the voice had come from. On a flat rock in a small clearing, perhaps 15 feet above the trail, she found 3 things arranged with a care that was immediately wrong. 3 smooth creek stones set in a triangle, each roughly the same size, each placed with its flattest face down. Above them, tied to a branch stub at approximately chest height, a strip of orange survey tape knotted around the stub and left to hang. And on the rock beside the stones, a child's boot. Small, maybe a size 4, worn at the toe and the outside heel in the specific way children's shoes wear when a kid walks with their weight slightly outward. Right foot. No left boot anywhere in the area. The boot was dry. She picked it up and turned it over. The sole had a repair on it. A patch of rubber cement or something similar applied over a separation at the ball of the foot. The kind of repair a parent does when a boot is still good, except for one spot, and replacing it seems wasteful. The repair had been done carefully. She set the boot back on the rock the way she'd found it and looked at the survey tape above it. The knot was a double half-hitch with a finishing tuck. It was the knot her team used to mark checked areas during searches. She had spent an afternoon 2 seasons ago teaching that specific knot to her junior volunteers, because the standard granny knot they'd been using was slipping off smooth branches. It was not a common knot. It was not a knot that appeared in general outdoor guides. It was the knot her team used, the one she had taught them, tied on a branch above a child's boot, in an area her team had not marked and had no reason to have been. She stood there for a long time. She called Carl that evening from her truck in the station parking lot, sitting with the engine off and the windows up because the conversation felt like one that should have walls around it. Carl had worked that ridge for 30 years before he retired, had started as a seasonal the same year Lynn had been born, and knew that section of the Appalachians the way old men know places they have loved and feared in equal measure. She had his number from a debrief 2 years earlier when his knowledge of the backcountry drainage patterns had helped close a search faster than it might have closed otherwise. She had not called him since. She called him now. She described what she'd heard on the ridge. She described what she'd found on the rock. She did not editorialize. She laid out the details the same way she'd lay out a search timeline. In order, without gaps, without emphasis on the parts that disturbed her most. She was quiet when she finished, and Carl was quiet for a moment on the other end, and she could hear in the background the sound of a television being turned down. He said, If you hear a child's voice from that ridge and there is no child, do not call back. Do not approach it. Just account for your team and walk out. Whatever it is, it does not want to be helped. It wants you to come looking." She asked him what he meant by that. He paused. She heard him exhale. "The boot is new," he said. "We used to find other things." She asked him what other things. He didn't answer that directly. He said he'd worked that ridge for 30 years and he'd heard the voice 4 times, and he'd never once found a child, and he'd never once found a set of prints that matched where the voice was coming from. He said the first time he'd heard it, he'd spent 2 hours searching that slope and found nothing, and come back to the trail and found his equipment had been gone through while he was searching. Nothing taken, just moved, rearranged, as if something had been curious about what he was carrying. He said after the 3rd time he'd told his supervisor, and his supervisor had listened and said nothing useful, and a week later had quietly reassigned Carl's patrol days so that he was no longer working the ridge on his own. Lynn sat with that. She asked if he knew anything about a missing child case, 1987, that section of the district. Another pause, longer this time. 9 years old, he said. Boy, went off trail above the ridge at the north end. Search ran 11 days. They never found him. He paused again. His family donated to the trail maintenance fund for years afterward. His mother walked that trail every spring until she couldn't anymore. She said she felt like he was still there. Lynn did not say anything for a moment. She had already pulled the case file that afternoon, sitting at the district computer after everyone else had left. The 1987 missing juvenile case number she'd written on the back of her hand because she hadn't wanted to print it. The file was thin. A district this size in 1987 didn't have the documentation infrastructure that existed now, and 11 days of search records took up less paper than a modern single-day operation. But the family statement was there, a handwritten page from the boy's mother, and near the bottom of it a description of what he'd been wearing. Well-worn boots, the mother had written. He'd outgrown them, really, but he wouldn't let me buy new ones. The right one had a spot on the sole I'd fixed with rubber cement. He'd watched me do it and said he wanted to learn how to fix things. Lynn had read that sentence 3 times. Then she had closed the file and sat at the desk with her hands flat on the table and not done anything for a while. The boot she'd found had a rubber cement repair on the right sole. She had not included that detail in any report. She had not photographed the boot with anything in frame that would indicate scale or placement, just the boot itself on the rock, the repair visible on the sole. The photograph was on her phone and had not been uploaded to any district system. She logged the boot as found property the following week, tagged it with a location reference that matched her GPS coordinate, submitted it to the district's Lost and Found protocol with a notation of approximate age and condition. No one claimed it. The log entry sat in the system. She did not attach it to the 1987 case file. She did not have enough to attach it to anything, and she knew what happened when you attach things you didn't have enough to attach. The connection got dismissed and the detail got lost, and what remained was a notation that made the ranger who filed it look like someone who saw patterns that weren't there. She was not willing to look like that. She was also not willing to pretend the repair on the sole was a coincidence she could live comfortably with. The knot above the boot continued to bother her more than anything else. She went back through her team's log from the search, checking every marked location, every flagged area, every notation that corresponded to a piece of survey tape deployed in the field. The ridge slope where she'd found the boot was not in any of them. Her team had not been above the trail on that slope at any point during the search. She checked Price's log separately, then Reyes's. Neither of them had been in that area. She asked them both, casually, in separate conversations, whether they'd done any off-trail marking during the search. Both said no. Price asked why. She said she was reconciling the tape inventory. He accepted that. Nobody on her team had tied that knot above that rock. She still runs searches in that district. She has not gone back to the ridge section north of the trail junction. The coordinate is still in her GPS unit, saved under a label that is just a number, no description. She has not deleted it, and she cannot fully explain why, whether it is professional habit, the instinct to keep data even when you don't know what it means, or something else. Something closer to the feeling that the coordinate is a point on a map that is now aware of her, and deleting it would not change that. The photograph of the boot is in a folder on her phone that is not backed up to any cloud service. She has not printed it. She showed it once to Carl, driving out to his place 6 months after the call, sitting at his kitchen table with his coffee that was much better than the station coffee. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the repair on the sole. He did not say whether he recognized it. He handed the phone back to her and looked out his kitchen window at the tree line behind his property, a line of old hardwood that came right up to the edge of his lawn, and he said, "You shouldn't go back up there alone." She said she knew. He looked at the tree line a moment longer and then looked back at her. "I mean anywhere on that ridge," he said. "Not just where you found it." She drove home with that. She has not been back to the ridge. She tells herself it is because her search assignments have taken her to other sectors, which is true. She tells herself the coordinate is just data, which is also true. She keeps the photograph on her phone in the unbacked folder, and she does not look at it often. But when she does, she looks at the repair on the sole, and she thinks about a boy who wanted to learn how to fix things, and she thinks about his mother walking that trail every spring until she couldn't anymore, and she thinks about what Carl said. It wants you to come looking. She has not told the junior team members what she found on that rock. She has not told Price about the knot, even though Price tied that knot 100 times that season. Even though Price would understand immediately what it meant to find it there. She keeps that detail with herself, the way you keep certain things, because sharing them means they become real in a way they aren't quite real yet when they're only yours. The following account is different from the others in one specific way. Every other ranger in this collection described something they could not explain. This one describes something they understood immediately. And that is what made it worse. Beth had worked wildlife monitoring for 4 years and had the specific patience the job required, which was different from the patience required by other kinds of field work. Trail assessment patience was physical. You kept walking, kept noting, kept the body moving through discomfort. Wildlife monitoring patience was a different kind. It was the patience of waiting for something to reveal itself, of checking the same camera stations month after month, of reviewing hundreds of photographs of empty forest and deer haunches, and the occasional blurred wing of a bird that had triggered the sensor wrong, and finding the work satisfying in its accumulation rather than its individual moments. She was good at the waiting. She was good at the looking. The corridor she worked was unofficial, meaning it wasn't a designated trail or a marked wildlife management zone, but rather a stretch of backcountry that population data suggested animals were using as a connection between 2 larger habitat areas. Her camera network was 12 stations spread across roughly 8 miles of ridge and hollow, each one mounted at a specific height and angle to maximize the capture area while minimizing false triggers. She had placed every camera herself over the course of 2 seasons. She knew each mounting location the way you know something you've thought about carefully: the specific tree, the specific angle, the distance from the station above and the station below, the kinds of animals each position was most likely to capture based on the terrain. Station 7 was on a ridge crossing, a narrow saddle between 2 higher points where the animal corridor naturally pinched down, and whatever was moving through it had to cross a specific 40-foot section. It was her best station for captures. bears, deer, turkey, twice a bobcat on the same week in November. Once, what she was reasonably certain was a fisher, though the angle hadn't been ideal. She checked it monthly without fail, even in weather that made the other stations less urgent. Station 7 always had something worth looking at. She did the circuit in late May, 2 days of hiking with an overnight at her regular camp near the creek at the low point of the corridor. First day, she hit stations 1 through 6, pulled cards, replaced batteries, checked angles against the spring vegetation growth that sometimes obscured a camera's field of view by the time the canopy filled in. Everything normal. She made camp in the early evening, heated water for a freeze-dried meal she'd been eating a version of for 4 years, listened to the creek run over the rocks below the tent, and reviewed the cards on her laptop before sleep. Stations 1 through 6 were unremarkable. Deer, deer, raccoon, deer. A black bear at Station 3 that had apparently investigated the camera mount closely enough that the image was mostly fur. A coyote pair at Station 5 moving east. She logged everything, noted the bear's interest in Station 3 as a possible mounting adjustment issue, closed the laptop. Slept well. The next morning, she hit Stations 7 through 12. Station 7 first, as always. She pulled the card, replaced the battery, checked the mount angle, unchanged, good, and hiked on to the remaining stations. It was a routine morning. The corridor was quiet in the way spring mornings are quiet before the heat comes up, the birds active in the canopy and the understory still dim and cool. That evening, she reviewed the remaining cards. Stations 8 through 12 first, the order she'd collected them. Normal captures, a few notes, nothing requiring immediate attention. Then, Station 7. 63 photographs. She went through them in order the way she always did, chronological, building a picture of the station's activity over the past month. Deer. 3 separate individuals based on body size and ear notching. 2 bears, one significantly larger than the other, on different nights. A turkey and her poults moving through in a group. The usual small mammal triggers, blurred shapes at the bottom of the frame that were probably mice or voles setting off the sensor from too close. A coyote moving west, the opposite direction from the pair at Station 5. She logged each capture as she went. Then the last photograph. Timestamp 3:08 a.m. The frame was lit by the camera's infrared flash, that flat, gray-green light that makes everything look the same distance away. In the center of the frame, filling most of it, was a figure. Human. Standing directly in front of the camera, face toward the lens, eyes open. The figure was close, 3 feet, maybe less, which was why it filled the frame the way it did, why the face was large enough to see clearly. The face was looking directly into the lens, not glancing at it, not caught mid-stride with the head turned toward a sound. Standing still, facing forward, eyes open and aimed at the exact center of the lens from a distance of approximately 3 feet. Beth sat with the laptop in the glow of her tent and looked at the image for a long time. She understood immediately what she was looking at. A person had been at Station 7 at 3:08 in the morning, standing close enough to the camera to fill the frame, looking directly into the lens. That was the fact. The facts around it were the problem. Station 7 was on an unofficial corridor that did not appear on any public trail map. Its location was in her internal survey database, accessible to her and the 2 other members of her monitoring team, neither of whom had any fieldwork scheduled in the corridor that month. The camera was mounted at 6 feet, angled slightly downward, on a tree that stood back from the crossing point, not on the crossing itself. There was no visible indicator light on the camera, no LED that would betray its presence in the dark. You would not find that camera at night unless you already knew it was there, knew the height, knew the angle, and knew where to stand to put your face in the center of the frame. The person in the photograph knew all of those things. She looked at the face. It was a face, clearly, not an artifact of the infrared light or a trick of branch shadow. Male, she thought, or possibly androgynous. The infrared flattened features in ways that made some distinctions unreliable. The expression was what she kept coming back to. Not startled, not looking up in the way people look up when they've been caught doing something. The expression was patient, settled. The expression of someone who had been standing there for a while and was comfortable with how long they'd been standing there. She later told Roy that it looked like someone who was waiting to be found. Roy had said nothing to that, but the way he'd said nothing told her he understood what she meant. She checked her station records. Camera 7, installed 11 months earlier. Location entered in the survey database on the day of installation, accessible internally, not linked to any public platform. She had shared the corridor map with her 2 team members and with the district's wildlife biologist, who had reviewed it once and returned it with comments about methodology. 4 people total had ever seen the precise locations of all 12 stations. The person in the photograph was not any of those 4 people. She was certain of that. She was also uncertain of almost everything else. She closed the laptop and listened to the creak and did not sleep as well as she had the night before. She went back to Station 7 the next morning before breaking camp, telling herself it was a standard mount check, which it partly was. The tree was a thick-trunked maple at the edge of the ridge saddle. The camera strapped to it at 6 feet with a nylon mounting strap that she had secured with the double loop method she used on all her stations, the kind of fastening that required knowing the strap design to undo without just cutting it. The camera was gone. The strap was still on the tree. That was the first thing she registered. The strap was there, the buckle end hanging loose at the bottom, unfastened in the correct sequence rather than cut or torn. The top loop was still secured around the tree. The bottom loop, the one that actually held the camera body against the bark, had been unfastened the way you unfastened it when you were removing the camera intentionally. Not forced, undone. She stood and looked at the strap for a moment, then looked around the immediate area. 30 feet from the tree, on a flat-topped boulder she used as a reference point when she was checking the camera angle, she found the camera, face down. The battery door was open. The battery still inside, but the door swung out as if someone had opened it and not bothered to close it again. The SD card slot was empty. The card she'd pulled the night before was in her card case in her pack. The slot was empty, not because the card had been taken, but because there was no card in it, which was simply the state of a camera whose card had been removed before it was placed here. She stood there and thought it through. The camera had been removed from the mounting strap by someone who knew how the strap worked. It had been carried 30 feet and placed face down on the reference boulder, which was a specific rock she used for a specific purpose and which someone would have to have watched her use in order to know its function. The battery door had been opened. She didn't know what to make of the battery door. It was either an inspection, someone checking what kind of battery the camera used, or it was something else, something she didn't have a framework for. She put the camera back on the mounting strap, resecured it at the correct angle, inserted the new card she'd brought to swap in. She hiked out to the remaining stations, finished the circuit, drove back to the district. She mentioned the camera issue to Roy at the end of the week, during the informal Friday debrief that the wildlife team ran when they were all in the office at the same time. She described the missing camera, the strap unfastened rather than cut, the camera on the reference boulder. She pulled up the photograph on her laptop while she was describing it, the 3:08 a.m. frame, the figure in front of the lens. Roy looked at the photograph for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, quietly, without looking away from the screen, "Has it come back twice or just once so far?" She said once, as far as she knew. He said, "Leave the camera where it is. Don't move it to a different mounting point, and don't go back to Station 7 at night." She asked why. He said the camera was already placed where it was placed and moving. It would change something he didn't want changed without thinking it through more carefully. She asked what he meant. He looked at her then, the way people look at you when they're deciding how much to say, and he said, "I've seen the photograph before. Different camera, different year." She asked him about the previous photograph. He said it had come from a camera placed by a previous survey worker in the same corridor, 6 years earlier. A different species survey Martin population work that had run for 18 months before the grant ended. The image had been flagged by the survey worker as a possible trespasser, submitted to the district as an unidentified person in a restricted monitoring area, investigated by a ranger who had gone out to the station location and found nothing unusual. The image had been run through the regional database of known trespassers and poachers. No match. It had been filed and nobody had followed up on it because there was nothing to follow up on. An unidentified person in the woods was not itself a reportable incident in any category that required action. Roy said he had been the one who'd filed it 6 years ago when he was newer to the district. He said he had thought about it on and off since then and had never found a satisfying explanation. Beth pulled Roy's old station records the following week, working through the archive on the district's shared drive. She found the Martin survey files, found the flagged image, and opened it. The timestamp read 3:08 a.m. She looked at her photograph and Roy's photograph side by side on her screen. Different camera bodies. Roy's was an older model, lower resolution, the infrared rendering slightly different in its tonal quality. Different card, different station number. The saddle crossing was the same location. She could see in the background of Roy's photograph the same distinctive double-trunk birch that stood 20 feet behind Station 7's position. The same birch she'd used as a navigation reference when she first sighted the station. The figure in Roy's photograph was standing in the same position. Same distance from the camera, same posture, face forward, eyes at the lens. Same patient expression, if expression was the right word for something that flat and that still. The same face. She sat with that for a long time. She compared the two images carefully, the way you compare things when you want to be wrong about what you're seeing and keep failing to find the difference. The infrared rendering made absolute certainty impossible. It always did. That flat, gray-green light erasing the fine detail that would let you say definitively yes or no. But the bone structure, the set of the eyes, the specific angle of the face relative to the lens, they matched in every way that the image quality allowed her to assess. The same face, 6 years apart, at the same location, at the same hour, looking into cameras whose locations were not public and whose placement had changed between surveys. She submitted her end-of-circuit report noting the camera as theft, location unrecovered, requesting a replacement unit. She did not mention the photograph comparison in the report. She noted the 3:08 a.m. image as an unidentified person, same notation Roy had used 6 years earlier, and filed it the same way. She saved both photographs to a folder on her personal laptop that was not connected to the district drive. She labeled the folder with a date range and nothing else. The camera at Station 7 ran for 3 more months. It captured 2 bears, a family of deer that appeared 11 times across the survey period, coyotes, the usual small mammal triggers. Nothing at 3:08 a.m. or any other hour of the night that was not an animal. The figure did not appear again. She stopped doing overnight camps on the circuit after that season. Day trips now, longer drives. She left earlier in the morning and came back later in the evening. But she did not sleep in the corridor anymore. She still reviews the SD cards at her desk at the end of each circuit day. She goes through them in chronological order, the way she always has. She sets aside the 3:08 a.m. frames to look at last. There has not been another one. She checks anyway. Roy retired from the district the following year. She saw him at the going away gathering the office put together, and they talked about the corridor survey and the population data and the plans for the next season's methodology. They did not talk about the photographs. Before he left the party, he stopped by the table where she was sitting and said, without particular emphasis, as if it were a piece of practical information she might find useful, "It only shows up on that camera position. I checked all the other stations from the old survey, just that one." She thanked him. He nodded and put on his jacket and left. She has checked all 12 of her current stations, every 3:08 a.m. frame across 4 years of surveys, across all 12 positions. 11 stations have produced nothing at that hour but darkness and the occasional animal. Station 7 has produced 1. The 7th account is the only one in this collection that involves 2 rangers, both of whom submitted independently, whose accounts match almost exactly, except for one detail that differs between them, and neither can explain the difference. Pete and Anna had been partners on patrol for 2 years, which was long enough to have developed the easy working rhythm that good field partners develop, who carried the clipboard, who took the photographs, who talked to landowners when landowners needed talking to, who drove on the long sections. Pete drove, Anna documented. It worked. They were not close friends outside the job, but they were the kind of colleagues who trusted each other's observations without needing to verify them, which made what happened on the logging road particularly difficult to reconcile, because what it ultimately said was that one of them had observed something that was not there. The boundary survey assignment came through in mid-October, the kind of clear, cool weather that makes fieldwork feel like a reasonable way to spend a day. The district had incorporated a section of former timber company land into the park boundary the previous spring, a parcel of roughly 400 acres that included a decommissioned logging road, some second-growth hardwood, a seasonal creek, and one structure, a hunting cabin marked on the transferred property map with a notation from the 1970s that read, "Structure deteriorated. Assess for removal or preservation." The task was straightforward. Walk the road, confirm the boundary markers, document the cabin, fill out the assessment form, drive back. They parked at the gate, which was a new installation, the Park Service chain and padlock still bright against the old wooden post. Pete had the clipboard with the assessment form and the property map, which was an enlarged photocopy of the parcel document, and had the specific problem of all enlarged photocopies of old survey maps. The scale was technically correct, but the visual proportions were off in ways that made distances feel different from what they were. They shared the last of the thermos Anna had brought, standing at the gate in the October light, Pete making a comment about the map's scale that made Anna laugh, and then they walked in. The logging road was 2 miles, which on an old road through second-growth hardwood felt comfortable. The surface was overgrown in the center strip between the old tire tracks, goldenrod and blackberry coming up through the gravel. The tracks themselves still firm enough to walk on without sinking. The trees on both sides were mostly maple and oak at 40 or 50 years of growth, young forest by Appalachian standards, the kind that comes back after clear-cutting with a particular density, everything fighting for the same light. The canopy was mostly turned by October, the reds and oranges past peak but still holding, the light coming through them amber-tinted and good. They walked easily. Pete noted 2 boundary markers in the first half-mile, confirmed their placement against the map, logged them. Anna photographed them. They heard a woodpecker working somewhere in the canopy, and Anna looked for it and didn't find it. Pete found a section of old skid road branching off the main track about a mile in, noted it on the map as an unmapped feature, photographed it. They talked about the survey methodology for the creek documentation and agreed on an approach. The cabin appeared at the end of the road, in a small clearing where the loggers had presumably staged equipment at some point. A flat area about an acre in size, the cabin sitting at the far edge where the tree line came back in. It was a single-story structure, board and batten siding, a metal roof that had gone from silver to a mottled rust brown, a covered porch across the front, 2 windows flanking a central door. It was in better condition than the map notation suggested by a significant margin. Pete said so. Anna agreed. The porch boards were solid when Pete stepped on them. No give, no rot, no soft spots. The windows were intact, both of them. No cracked panes, no cardboard patches. The door sat square in its frame, and the hinges showed no significant rust. The exterior siding had weathered, but not failed. The roof, as far as they could see from the ground, was intact. Whatever structure deteriorated had meant in 1972, it did not describe what was in front of them now. Either the notation had been wrong from the start, or someone had been maintaining this cabin. Anna made a note of that. It changed the assessment category from likely removal to possible preservation, which changed the paperwork, which meant more thorough interior documentation. Pete tried the door. The knob turned and the door opened without resistance, which meant it was unlocked, which meant either it had never been locked or someone had been here recently enough that locking it had seemed unnecessary. Standard assessment protocol required interior documentation when the structure was accessible. Pete stepped inside. The smell hit first. Old wood and a faint metallic undertone that might have been rust from the roof flashing, and something else underneath it, something between soil and ash. The smell of a space that had been closed for a long time but not entirely sealed. The light inside was the muted amber of the October canopy coming through the 2 windows, enough to see by, but not enough to read by. Pete stood in the doorway and looked at the room and took it in. Single main space. Wood stove on the left wall, a squat cast-iron unit on a hearth of flat stones, the stovepipe going up through a collar in the ceiling. A table in the center of the room, rectangular, wood, 2 chairs pushed in, the kind of furniture that gets left in hunting cabins because it's too heavy to bother moving out and too plain to bother stealing. On the wall above the table, an old calendar, the paper yellowed and curled at the corners, the image a generic mountain scene, the month and year showing a date 11 years prior. The floor was wood, bare, clean enough that the dust pattern suggested the space hadn't been used heavily in some time, but also hadn't been abandoned entirely. The corners were clear. No debris, no animal nesting, no evidence of water intrusion from the ceiling. He stepped back onto the porch. Anna stepped in 10 seconds later with her camera ready. She documented the room she saw. They did not discuss what they had each seen inside the cabin. That was standard documentation procedure. You recorded your own observations independently before comparing, to avoid one person's account shaping the others. Pete filled out the assessment form on the porch while Anna finished her interior photographs. She came out after about 10 minutes, the camera around her neck, her notebook open in her hand where she'd written her own descriptive notes. Pete had his form filled out. They stood on the porch in the October light with the clearing behind them, and the tree line past it and the road back to the gate stretching away to the north. Anna said, reviewing her notes, partial wall dividing the main space. Wood stove on the right, no table, floor covered in old tarps folded against the walls. Closed door at the back, about 6 feet of clearance between the partial wall and the south window. Pete looked at his form. He had written, single main space undivided, wood stove left wall, table center with 2 chairs, calendar on wall above table, floor bare and clean, no interior door. They looked at each other. Pete went back inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. Single space, undivided. Wood stove on the left. Table and chairs. Calendar. He came back out and told Anna what he saw. She went back inside and came back out and told him she saw a partial wall and a closed door at the back and no table. They stood on the porch and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Pete pulled up his photos on his camera screen. Anna pulled up hers. The photographs did not match. They were clearly taken inside the same building. The exterior shell was identical. The ceiling height was the same. The window positions matched. The quality of light through the 2 windows was consistent in both sets. But Pete's photographs showed an undivided room with a wood stove on the left wall and a table with 2 chairs in the center. Anna's photographs showed a space with a partial wall stopping about 4 feet from the ceiling. A wood stove on the right wall, no table, tarps folded along the base of the walls, and a plain wood door in the back wall that Pete's photographs did not show. Pete looked at Anna's photographs for a long time. He kept finding the back wall in her images and looking at the door. It was a plain interior door, wood, no window in it, a simple round knob. There was no door in his photographs. There was not even a wall where a door might have been. There was the back wall of the cabin, and the back wall was a single flat surface without any opening in it. Anna looked at Pete's photographs with the same focused attention. She kept finding the left wall in his images and looking at where the wood stove was. In her photographs, the left wall was clear, just boards, no stove. The stove was on the right. It was not a subtle difference in perception or angle. The stove was on a different wall. They stood on the porch without talking for a while. Pete said, finally, "We walked in through the same door." Anna said yes. "Same room," he said. She looked at her photographs. "Same room," she said. They walked back to the gate together and drove to the station and filed a joint assessment report that described the cabin's exterior condition, noted the unexpected state of preservation relative to the 1972 notation, and included the phrase interior inconsistencies requiring further review in the section where detailed room measurements were supposed to go. It was a phrase that could mean a number of things: conflicting measurements from different entry points, ambiguous structural features, areas requiring additional lighting for proper documentation. It was professional language for something they did not have professional language for. Nobody at the station asked what the inconsistencies were. On the walk back to the gate, Anna had mentioned something she'd found in the parcel transfer documents the week before, going through the paper file rather than the digital summary they'd been given for the patrol. At the bottom of the original boundary survey document, in the margin, in handwriting that was not the survey officer's, someone had written, "Do not enter alone. Assess exterior only." It was not initialed. It was not dated beyond the document it appeared on, which was dated the previous spring. Neither of them had seen that note before the patrol. It had been in the paper file, and the paper file had not been included in the digital packet their supervisor had sent them. Pete thought about that note on the drive back. He thought about the fact that they had entered together, not alone, and had still come out with photographs of 2 different rooms. He thought about what enter alone might mean in the context of a structure that apparently showed its interior differently depending on who was looking at it. He did not share this thought with Anna, partly because it had no practical application, and partly because saying it out loud would make it a thing that had been said between them, and neither of them seemed ready for that. 3 weeks after their patrol, the district assigned a second team to complete the interior assessment, since Pete and Anna's documentation had been flagged as incomplete. 2 rangers, neither of whom had been briefed on the previous visit beyond the phrase "interior inconsistencies requiring further review." They went in, spent 40 minutes inside, came out, and filed a report. The room they described was empty, single space, no wood stove, no table, no chairs, no calendar, no partial wall, no tarps, no back door. A bare wood floor with a light dust accumulation, suggesting no recent use, the dust undisturbed and even. No features of any kind beyond the structural shell. Their photographs showed an empty room with nothing in it except boards and the weak light from 2 windows. The photographs from all 3 visits were in the district file. Nobody filed an explanatory memo. Nobody requested a structural review or a building history inquiry. The cabin was added to the assessment queue for the following year with a notation that said, "Documentation ongoing," and a recommendation for either restoration as a historic structure or removal depending on the outcome of a more thorough assessment. The demolition order came through 8 months later and was canceled 2 weeks after that. The cancellation attributed to a budget reallocation that reprioritized active trail maintenance over structure removal. The cabin remained standing. The file remained open. The 3 sets of photographs remained in the same folder in the district's shared drive, labeled by date and team, and anyone who opened the folder and looked at all 3 would see what Pete and Anna had eventually made themselves say out loud, sitting in the station parking lot after their debrief, in the specific quiet of 2 people who trust each other's observations and have run out of ways to make them agree. Anna stopped trusting her own photographs for a while after that. Not in a way that affected her work, she continued documenting, continued filing, continued producing the clear and accurate records that field documentation required. But she started doing a second step that she had not done before. On every structure she entered for the rest of that season, she had her partner describe the room out loud before she began photographing. She would stand in the doorway and listen to the verbal description, and then she would photograph what was there. She told Pete about this practice at the end of the season when they were doing their final patrol together. He said that he had started doing the same thing, independently, about 2 weeks after the cabin visit. He had not told her. She had not told him. They had arrived at the same solution to the same problem without discussing it, which was either a reasonable professional response to a shared experience or something else. The cabin is still standing. As of the last update to the district's property database, it is still listed as documentation ongoing. The file has not been closed. The 3 sets of photographs are still in the folder. Nobody has gone back to do the more thorough assessment. The paper file with the handwritten margin note is still in the district records room. Do not enter alone. The note is still there, in unidentified handwriting, at the bottom of a document that nobody looks at because everything relevant has been digitized. Everything except that. After 7 accounts, a pattern might seem to be forming. What the next story shows is that sometimes the pattern is what finds you. Tom had 18 years in the service and a reputation that meant something in the specific way reputations mean something in small professional communities. Not famous, not decorated, just known. Known as the ranger you called when the situation was ambiguous, and you needed someone who would assess it accurately and not add noise to it. He had worked the same district for most of those 18 years, knew its backcountry the way a physician knows a longtime patient. Not just the current state, but the history, the patterns, the places where something had been wrong before and might be wrong again. He was not imaginative in the way that causes problems. He was precise. He kept good notes. He did not embellish. The 2-night backcountry patrol was standard for that sector, the kind of assignment that required a certain threshold of experience, because the terrain was remote enough that a poor decision compounded faster than it would closer to a road. 10 miles of service road to the trailhead, 4 miles of trail to the patrol zone, 14 miles from the nearest paved road. His radio had reliable contact with dispatch from 3 specific high points in the sector, and poor to no contact everywhere else. He knew the high points. He used them at his scheduled check-in times and did not count on anything in between. He made camp the first evening at a site he had used at least a dozen times, a flat area beside a seasonal stream that ran reliably in spring but had gone to a trickle by late summer. The fire ring was his own construction from 2 seasons back, the stones still in the arrangement he'd left them. He set up efficiently, the way someone sets up when they've done it enough that each step is a decision that's already been made. Tent, sleeping pad, bag, cook kit, bare hang for the food, radio on its charging pad from the small solar panel he carried for overnight trips. He heated a tin of soup on the camp stove, ate it standing up, washed the tin in the creek, set it to dry. He wrote his field notes for the day's patrol by headlamp. 2 trail register checks, 1 damaged boundary marker noted and photographed, storm debris on the access trail documented. He read 4 pages of the paperback he'd been carrying for 2 trips and set it face down on the sleeping pad and turned off the headlamp. The evening radio check at 7 had been normal. District roundup, all units accounted for, no active incidents, weather holding clear through the following afternoon. He had given his position, noted his planned route for the next day, signed off. He was the only unit in that sector. That was standard. He had been the only unit in that sector many times. He fell asleep easily, the way people fall asleep when they've been moving all day, and the body makes the decision before the mind does. At 2 a.m., the radio spoke. He was awake immediately, the way field people wake, not gradually but completely, present and oriented in the first second. The radio was on the ground beside the tent, the volume set to its normal overnight level, low enough not to disturb sleep but high enough to wake him if traffic came through. He heard the transmission clearly. It was formatted correctly. That was the first thing he registered. Not a burst of static that might have carried a fragment of someone else's communication from a distant repeater. A formatted Park Service transmission, the call sign structure he knew as well as he knew his own name, district identifier, unit designation, the specific phonetic sequencing that dispatch used when initiating contact with a field unit. His call sign, his sector designation, his district. All correct. Then the request for a position check, delivered in a calm, male voice at the measured pace of someone who used radio communication professionally. He picked up the radio and gave his position. It was automatic, the response trained into him by 18 years of radio protocol. A formatted call on his frequency with his call sign got a response. That was how it worked. He gave his GPS coordinates, confirmed his sector, waited. The voice acknowledged his position. Correct readback, his coordinates repeated accurately. Then it asked him to confirm whether he had made contact with the hiker group at the creek junction. He lay there in the dark for a moment. There was no hiker group. There were no permit applications for this backcountry zone that week. He had checked the register at the trailhead and it had been empty, and the district's permit system showed no approved overnight applications for his sector. The creek junction was a specific location he knew, a confluence of the seasonal stream and a larger creek about a mile south of his camp, a place where 2 trails crossed and where hikers sometimes camped illegally when they didn't want to deal with the permit process. But there was nobody there. He had hiked past it that afternoon and the area had been empty. He said so. No hiker group. Sector empty as of his afternoon patrol. He asked the voice to clarify the source of the hiker report. The voice paused. Not a transmission gap, not static, a pause, the kind that happens when someone is considering what to say next. Then, stay at your current position. Do not approach the creek junction. We'll advise. He asked for the caller's identifier. The voice gave one. He wrote it in his field notebook by headlamp, the phonetic sequence the voice provided, pressing hard enough on the paper that he'd be able to read it in the morning, even if he doubted what he'd heard. He read it back for confirmation. The voice confirmed it. Then the radio returned to its standby hiss. He lay in his sleeping bag with the notebook on his chest and looked at the tent ceiling in the dark. He ran through the possibilities the way he ran through all possibilities, systematically, giving each one its fair assessment before moving to the next. Dispatch, running an unscheduled check using a secondary protocol he wasn't familiar with. A training exercise involving his sector that he hadn't been briefed on. A transmission from another district bleeding through on a shared frequency. An equipment malfunction producing voice artifacts from a partial signal. He gave each one its time. None of them explained the pause before, "Stay at your current position." He stayed at his current position. In the morning, he broke camp and hiked to the first high point on his patrol route where radio contact was reliable and called dispatch. He asked about the overnight transmission. He gave the time, the frequency, the call sign identifier he'd written down. Dispatch had no record of any outgoing call to his unit after the 7 o'clock evening roundup. He read back the identifier. The dispatcher checked twice. No match in the district's current call sign registry. He asked her to check the regional registry, the one that included units from adjacent districts that sometimes shared frequency infrastructure. She checked. No match. He thanked her, hiked on, completed his patrol, and made camp the second night at the same site. He had noted the first night's transmission in his field log with precise detail: time, frequency, content, identifier. And he had not mentioned it in his morning radio check because he did not yet know what to do with it. He needed the second night first. He needed to know whether it was a single anomaly or something with a pattern. He did not have to wait long to find out. He was more deliberate about the second night's camp. He noted the time he ate, soup again, crackers from the side pocket of his pack, the meal he defaulted to on backcountry overnights because it was light and required no real preparation. And he noted the time he turned in and the state of the fire, which he let burn down completely rather than banking it, so that by 11 o'clock the ring held nothing but gray ash, and the site was lit only by stars and the faint ambient glow that clear mountain nights produce when there is no moon. He wanted accurate conditions. He wanted to know exactly what was visible and what wasn't. He had decided he would not respond if the radio came on. He would listen. He would note everything. He would not transmit. At 2:07 a.m. the radio activated. Same voice. Same call sign format. Same district identifier and unit designation and his sector number. 7 minutes later than the previous night, which was the kind of detail that could mean nothing, or could mean that whatever was producing the transmission had a schedule, and schedules implied something with enough consistency to keep one. He lay still. He did not pick up the radio. The voice said, "Confirming your position. Wanted to make sure you had the soup and the crackers again." A brief pause. The same quality of pause as the night before, not technical, deliberate. Then, "We can see your fire position. Wanted to make sure you're comfortable." He did not move. His fire had been dead ash for 3 hours. He had specifically let it burn down for reasons he was now very aware of. The site was dark. There was no visible light source anywhere in his camp. Whatever was transmitting to him could not see his fire position because there was no fire position to see. It was describing something that did not exist, with the casual confidence of something that believed it did. Or it was describing something he could not see himself. Some quality of the site that was visible from outside it in a way it was not visible from within. He did not allow himself to spend long on that interpretation. He had decided to be precise, and precision required that he not populate the darkness with explanations that would frighten him into making poor decisions. He knew what he'd eaten because he'd eaten it. He had not transmitted that information at any point. Not to dispatch, not in his field notes, not in any radio call. The soup and crackers were a detail from inside his camp and his camp only. A detail that existed in no document or transmission. The voice knew it. He lay still with his hand resting beside the radio, and he did not transmit, and after 40 seconds of silence, the voice said, with the same measured calm, "Stay where you are. We'll advise in the morning." Then the frequency returned to standby. He did not sleep after that. He lay in the dark and listened to the sector, and it was quiet in the way backcountry is quiet when you are paying attention to it. Not silent, never fully silent, but layered and specific. Insects and the creek trickle and the occasional shift of wind in the canopy and the small sounds of the forest working through the night. He listened to all of it and tried to separate each sound into a known category and largely succeeded. Nothing moved around the camp perimeter. Nothing approached. Whatever was transmitting to him was not, as far as he could determine, physically present in his immediate area. Hank had told him something before this patrol. Hank ran dispatch for the district and had been doing it for 25 years, long enough that he knew the backcountry sectors the way rangers knew them, through accumulated reports and radio logs, and the patterns that emerged when you paid attention to the same frequencies for a quarter century. Before Tom had left on this patrol, during the routine gear-out and briefing that Hank ran for all solo backcountry assignments, Hank had said something that Tom had noted as unusual and filed without fully examining. He had said, "If you get a call in the middle of the night on that sector, and the call sign doesn't match anything you recognize, don't acknowledge, don't answer, just click off." Tom had asked if there was a known interference issue on that frequency in the sector. Hank had said not exactly. Tom had asked what not exactly meant. Hank had looked at the briefing sheet in his hand and said it was just a precaution, something that had come up before and been noted in the sector file. Better to mention it than not. Tom had not pushed further. He had been on the job 18 years, and he knew that Hank was careful with language, and that not exactly was not the same as no, and that something that had come up before and been noted meant there was a file he could request to look at. He had not requested it before the patrol, because the patrol had seemed routine. He was requesting it now, mentally, lying in the dark on his second night, having not followed the instruction on the first night. He hiked out the next morning, completed his remaining trail checks, logged his findings, reached the trailhead by early afternoon, drove back to the station. He filed his patrol report, trail conditions, register checks, storm debris, the boundary marker he'd noted on day one. At the end of the report, under anomalies, he wrote, "Radio anomalies on both nights, possible frequency interference, recommend technical review of base unit." Then he went to find Hank. Hank was in the dispatch room. Tom put his field notebook on the desk, opened to the page where he'd written the identifier from the first night's transmission, and slid it across. Hank looked at it without picking up the notebook. He looked at it for long enough that Tom understood he was not reading it for the first time. Tom asked him what it was. Hank said it wasn't anything current. Tom asked what that meant. Hank said the format was right, but the specific sequence didn't match any active or reserve unit in the district's registry, and hadn't as far as he knew. Tom asked how far back the registry went. Hank said he'd have to pull the archive. Tom said he'd like him to pull it. Hank pulled it. They went back 15 years in the district's call sign records. The identifier Tom had written down did not appear in any of them. They checked the regional archive through a network request that took 2 days to come back. No match there either. The radio was inspected by a field communications tech the following week. Full diagnostic, antenna check, frequency calibration, internal log review. The tech found no malfunction. The internal transmission log, the record the radio kept automatically of all outgoing calls, showed 2 entries for the patrol period. The first was Tom's position response on night 1, timestamped at 2:04 a.m., his voice, his GPS coordinates. That one he remembered. The second was timestamped at 2:07 a.m. on night 2, 5 seconds long, his unit, outgoing. He had not transmitted at 2:07 a.m. on night 2. He had made the decision not to respond, had kept his hand beside the radio and not picked it up, and he was as certain of that as he was certain of anything from those 2 nights. But the log showed an outgoing call. 5 seconds of transmission from his unit at the exact moment the voice had been speaking to him, during the 40 seconds of silence after the soup and crackers detail, before the stay where you are instruction. 5 seconds. He did not know what had been in those 5 seconds. The log showed the transmission had occurred, but not its content, because the unit logged metadata rather than audio. He would not know what had gone out on his frequency at 2:07 a.m. on the second night of his patrol, in a sector 14 miles from the nearest paved road, from a radio he had not touched. He requested non-solo backcountry assignments for the remainder of his tenure. The request was approved without comment, filed as a standard safety consideration, which was the language the Park Service used for decisions that didn't require explanation. He served 14 more months and retired. At the going-away gathering, he was quiet in the way people are quiet when something has settled in them without resolving. He accepted the handshakes and the coffee cake and the framed district map they gave him, and he drove home. In his farewell post to the closed ranger network, he described the 2 nights precisely, in the same way he had done everything precisely for 18 years. At the end of it, he wrote, "I still do not know what it wanted me to stay away from at the creek junction. I have thought about going back to look. I am not going to." The radio sits in the district equipment room, checked out and returned by whoever uses that sector now. Tom does not know if anyone has had a similar experience on those 2 nights. He did not ask before he left, and he has not asked since. He is retired. He lives 40 miles from the district. He does not go into that backcountry anymore. The transmission log still shows the entry from 2:07 a.m., 5 seconds. Outgoing, his unit. No content recorded. There is one more account before the last one. This one comes from a ranger who spent 2 decades in the service and encountered the same thing twice, 11 years apart, in 2 different districts. He submitted this to the network with a note that said, "I am only telling this because I want someone to know that it follows people, not places. People." Will was the kind of ranger who kept his field notebooks. Not just the current seasons, all of them, going back to his first posting, lined up on a shelf in his home office in the order he'd filled them, each one labeled on the spine with the year and district. He had 22 of them by the time he left the service. He was precise about his notes the way some people are precise about photographs, understanding that the details you capture in the moment are the ones you cannot reconstruct later. That memory fills in gaps with what seems right rather than what was, and that what seems right and what was are not always the same thing. He trusted his notebooks more than he trusted his memory. That habit is important to understand, because when the thing he could not explain happened to him twice, 11 years apart, the notebooks were how he knew it was the same thing. The first time was his 3rd year in the service. He was 26, posted to a district in the southern part of the Appalachian range, the kind of terrain that was all ridge and hollow, steep slopes dropping fast into narrow creek drainages. The forest old enough in the protected sections that the canopy was 60 feet up, and the understory was dim even at midday. He had been assigned a solo assessment of a trail closure, a section of trail that a landslide had buried 2 months earlier. The closure already posted and signed, the assessment task being to document the debris field and estimate the work hours for clearing. It was a half-day job, maybe 6 miles round trip, the kind of assignment that gets handed to 3rd-year rangers because it requires competence but not much complexity. The day was clear, a Wednesday in late September. The trail empty the way weekday trails are empty in a non-peak season. He had the closure section documented by noon, photographs of the debris field, measurements, work estimate, notes on the drainage issues that had likely contributed to the slide. He ate his lunch at a viewpoint a 1/4 mile above the debris, sitting on a flat outcrop of sandstone with a ridge view that went blue and layered to the south. The kind of view that makes fieldwork feel like something other than work. He drank his coffee from the thermos and looked at the ridges, and felt, in the specific way that solitude in good terrain produces, genuinely content. He started back down at 12:45. The trail was 4 miles out to the trailhead from the viewpoint, mostly downhill, the surface dry and firm. He moved at a comfortable pace, not hurrying, the afternoon giving him plenty of time. He was perhaps 2 miles from the trailhead, the trail descending through a section of older timber where the trees were thick enough that the trail felt enclosed, when he became aware of the footsteps behind him. Not a sudden awareness, a gradual one, the kind that builds through several steps before you name it. He had been hearing the sound for perhaps 30 seconds before he identified it as footsteps. Bipedal, the pattern clear, left, right, at the same pace as his own. Not faster, not slower. Matching. He slowed slightly to test it, and the sound slowed with him. He sped up, and it sped up. He was not running, just walking, and the sound was walking with him, behind him, at a consistent distance he estimated as 20 or 30 feet. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. He stood on the trail for a moment, listening to the forest, which was quiet in the late afternoon way of forests, the bird activity winding down, the insects not yet started, the canopy still enough that there was no leaf noise. He turned around. The trail was empty. As far as he could see in both directions, nothing. The light came through the canopy at its afternoon angle, striping the trail in alternating light and shadow, and there was no one in any of it. He looked into the trees on both sides. Nothing moved. He told himself what made sense to tell himself. Echo off the ridge face, the slope doing something acoustic that made his own footsteps return to him from a slight delay and a slightly different direction. A second hiker somewhere on a parallel slope or a parallel trail, the sound carrying through the timber in a way that made it seem close when it wasn't. His own footfall bouncing off a rock face he couldn't see, but that was near enough to create the effect. All of those were possible. He noted the location in his field notebook, a brief entry, just the trail name, the approximate mile marker, and the word footsteps with a question mark beside it. And he hiked out. He did not look back again. He made that choice consciously and he kept it. At the trailhead, he got in his truck and drove back to the station, and he did not mention it to anyone. Not that day, not that week. He filed it under the category of strange trail acoustics, a real phenomenon in ridge and hollow terrain, not worth discussing because he had no way to make it interesting to anyone else, and he was not certain enough of what he'd heard to want to sound like someone who spooked at his own footsteps. He was 26. He had something to prove about being the kind of ranger who didn't spook at his own footsteps. He thought about it occasionally over the following years, less as time passed, which was how most things worked. By the time 11 years had gone by, it was a memory he kept in the same folder as other unexplained minor experiences, the kind of thing that had bothered him once and then become an anecdote he never told. He had moved to a second district by then, a posting further north. Different mountains, different character to the terrain. The southern district had been ridge and hollow and old pine. The northern district was mostly oak and maple, broader ridges, the topography less dramatic, but the backcountry still deep enough to be genuinely remote in the sections away from the maintained trails. He was a senior ranger by then. 12 years in, 16 years total. The kind of experience that meant he got the assignments that required judgment, not just competence. The trail maintenance inspection that fall was one of those. A section of remote trail that a volunteer crew had been working on, checking their progress against the work order, noting any issues with their methodology or materials. 2 miles of trail, and out and back, nothing complicated. He had done similar inspections 100 times. He started the inspection at mid-morning, documented what the crew had done, noted 2 areas where the tread construction didn't match the specifications and would need revision, photographed everything, left written notes at the crew's materials cache for the crew leader. He was heading back out by 2 in the afternoon, which gave him comfortable daylight. The trail ran through oak and maple, the leaves at their October peak. The ground beneath them a layer of color that had been dry long enough to be crisp underfoot. He was 2 miles from the trailhead. The footsteps started behind him. He stopped walking before he finished identifying what he was hearing. The same gradual recognition following the same sequence. The 30 seconds of awareness before naming. The slowing and matching. The stop and stop. He stood on the trail with the October canopy around him, and he listened to the silence the footsteps had left, and he felt something he had not felt the first time, 11 years earlier. He felt the specific quality of recognition, not of the place, not of the trail, of the experience. He had felt this before. He had stood in this exact stillness, in a different forest, in a different state, in a different year, and heard this same silence arrive at the moment he stopped. He turned around. The trail was empty. He stood there for a full minute, which is a long time to stand still on a trail. He looked at the trail surface, the crisp October leaves, the places where his boots had pressed them flat on the way in. He could see his own tracks clearly. He could see where he had been walking. He could see clearly that nothing else had been walking behind him, because the leaves behind him were undisturbed in the stretches between his own prints, and you cannot walk on dry October leaves without disturbing them. He said, "I know you're there." His voice in the timber sounded ordinary and too loud at the same time. The footsteps did not start again, but from the tree line to his left, maybe 15 feet off the trail, something stepped once on the dry leaves and went quiet. One step, deliberate enough to be heard, and then nothing. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked out, facing forward, and did not look back. He told one person, a ranger at the northern district named Sheila, someone he'd worked alongside for 3 years, and trusted in the specific way you trust people who have demonstrated good judgment in difficult situations. He told her a week after the inspection, sitting in the break room at the end of a shift, and he was careful about how he told it. Factual, sequential, without emphasis on the parts that still bothered him most, the way he wrote field notes. He described the first incident, the one from 11 years earlier, and then the second one. And he said that the specific details were the same in a way that he could not account for by coincidence. Sheila listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had heard something similar from someone else, a ranger from a district she'd worked before this one, but she couldn't remember the details clearly enough to say whether it matched. She said it as a piece of information she was offering, not as validation or dismissal, and he appreciated that. He filed it under the category of possibly relevant and didn't follow up on it because he didn't know how to follow up on it without asking Sheila to dig into a memory she'd already told him was unclear. That evening, at home, he pulled both notebooks from the shelf. The first one was from his third year, the Southern District posting. He found the entry without difficulty. He knew roughly where it was. Late September, the trail closure assessment. The entry was brief as he'd remembered. Trail name, approximate mile marker, the word footsteps with a question mark. Below it, added later the same day in slightly different ink pressure, the time, 2:50 p.m. approximately 2 miles from TH. He had gone back and added the time detail that evening, the way he sometimes did when he thought a note might need context later. He checked the second notebook at this season's the Northern District, found the maintenance inspection entry. The details were fuller because he'd written them the same evening with the intent of being thorough, in case they mattered. Time of incident, 4:19 p.m. Location, approximately 2 miles from TH Trail 22. He sat with both notebooks open on the desk. The first incident, approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. Time noted as approximately 2:50 p.m. Trail 14, Southern District. The second incident, approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. Time noted as 4:19 p.m. Trail 22, Northern District. Not the same time, not the same trail. Different mountains, different states, different terrain types, 11 years apart. But the distance was the same, 2 miles from the trailhead, both times, in both directions from a parking area he'd driven to alone. And the times, while not identical, shared something he circled with his pen and then looked at for a long time. Both were in the window between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, late enough in the day that the light was going sideways through the trees, late enough that the forest had shifted from its midday quality to its late-day quality, that specific change in atmosphere that experienced field people feel before they can name it. He didn't know what to do with that. He wrote it down anyway. He wrote, "Same distance both times. Late afternoon both times. Trail empty in both directions when I looked. No prints behind me on the second occurrence despite dry leaf cover. One deliberate step from the tree line when I spoke." He read it back, and it looked, on paper, exactly like what it was. Precise notes about something he could not explain. He looked up the ranger from his first district. Not his former partner or his former supervisor, his mentor from that first posting. A woman named Gloria, who had been in the service for 20 years when he started and had retired to somewhere in Western Virginia. He had her contact information from a group email that had gone around when a former colleague had died 2 years earlier. He used it now. He called her on a Thursday evening. She answered after 3 rings, and he said who he was, and she said she remembered him. Of course she did. And they exchanged a few minutes of ordinary conversation. "How are you? How is the district?" And then he said he wanted to ask her something and described it as a field experience question he'd been thinking about. He described the incident from his third year on her district. The trail, the approximate location, the footsteps, the stop and start, the empty trail when he turned around. He was specific because Gloria had always responded better to specificity than to vague accounts. When he finished, there was a pause on the line. She asked, "Did it match your pace exactly, or was it always a half a step behind?" he felt something settle in his chest in an uncomfortable way. The notebooks were open on the desk in front of him, and he looked at them and said, half a step behind. That was the detail he had not included in his account because he had not been certain enough of it to state it as fact. The impression that the footsteps were not precisely simultaneous with his, but slightly delayed. A fraction of a step behind, like a translation rather than a copy. She said, "Mine was too." He waited. "I worked that trail section for 6 years," she said. "I heard it 4 times. Always the same stretch, always the same quality, half a step behind, stopping when I stopped. The last time I heard it, I was 2 years from retirement, and I sat down on a log on that trail, and I said out loud, 'I know what you are, and I'm not interested,' and it stopped. I don't know if that was the right thing to say. I've wondered." He asked her why she had never told him. He had been her mentee on that district. He had worked that trail section regularly during his posting there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't want it to follow you." He sat with that. She said it simply, without drama, the way she had always said difficult things, as a fact, as information, as something she had decided and was now explaining. She had believed, or had come to believe over 6 years of encountering the thing on that trail, that discussing it transferred something. Not proved, not certain, but believed. And so she had not discussed it with the younger rangers who worked her district. She had not discussed it with him. He asked if she thought it had followed him anyway. She paused again, longer this time. "I think some people carry something that makes them more visible to certain things," she said. "I don't know what that means exactly. I don't know if I believe it as a fact or if I just couldn't come up with anything better." Another pause. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. It wouldn't have changed what happened, but you should have known." He said he understood. He did, mostly. He also understood that he had spent 11 years carrying the first incident as an unexplained minor experience, and had now learned that his mentor had experienced the same thing on the same trail section 6 years before he had, and had chosen not to tell him because she believed telling him might transfer it, and that by the time she'd made that choice, something had already found him on her trail and followed him north. He wrote all of it down. Both notebooks open on the desk, and a third one open to a fresh page, writing in the careful hand he'd always used. He wrote Gloria's words precisely, including the pause before mine was too. He wrote the detail about half a step behind. He wrote, "I didn't want it to follow you," and then he sat for a while without writing anything. He retired 2 years after the second incident. He had intended to stay longer, but the intention had become difficult to sustain. He moved to a city, a mid-sized one in a state without significant mountain terrain, and got work that kept him indoors and near other people and away from trails that went 2 miles into terrain, where the late afternoon light went sideways, and the footsteps knew the distance. He hikes occasionally when he goes to visit his daughter, who lives near a state park with well-maintained trails and good foot traffic. He always goes with someone. He checks behind himself the way people check behind themselves in parking lots at night. Quickly, without making it obvious, trying not to seem like they are doing it. His daughter has never asked him about it. He thinks she has noticed. He has not done a solo trail patrol since the afternoon in the October leaves, when something stepped once from the tree line to let him know it had heard what he said. He lives in a city now. The footsteps have not come back. He checks, though, he still checks. And then there is the last account. The one that people in that district still do not discuss by name. This was submitted through a retired ranger who said she was not the one who experienced it, but that she was the one who had to explain it to the family afterward. She said she still does not know what to tell them. Meredith had been with the service long enough that she had developed what she privately called the vocabulary of incomplete explanations, the professional language the Park Service used when something had happened that couldn't be categorized in the available categories. Wellness-related early return, environmental anomaly requiring further assessment, incident under review pending additional documentation. She had used all of those phrases in reports over the years, and she had understood each time she used them that they were placeholders, professional courtesies extended to events that the forms were not designed to hold. She was good at her job, and her job sometimes required that kind of language, and she had made her peace with that. What she had not made her peace with, in the 2 years since Kay had finally told her what happened on the 4th day, was the notebook. She still had it. She had asked Kay if she could take it home the evening Kay told her, and Kay had said yes without hesitation, as if she had been waiting to give it to someone, and was relieved to have the weight of it out of her hands. Meredith had driven home with it on the passenger seat, not in her bag, and she had put it on her desk when she got home, and she had not been able to put it anywhere less visible since. It sat there now, in the corner of her desk, beside her coffee mug and her reading glasses. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has no right to take up as much space as it does. Kay had come out 3 days early. That was the first thing Meredith had had to process, the practical, administrative fact of it, before the explanation, before the notebook. Kay had appeared at the district trailhead on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before peak fall color, 3 days before her scheduled return from a 5-day backcountry patrol of the district's most remote sector. She had hiked out alone, without radio contact, without the protocol check-in from the sector's one reliable high point that solo backcountry patrols were required to make before beginning their exit. Her truck was at the trailhead where she'd left it. She got in it and drove to the station and parked and walked in and sat down at the table in the break room and did not say anything for a while. Meredith had been the senior ranger on duty. She had sat across from Kay and she had looked at Kay's face, which was the face of someone who had been in the field for several days. Weathered, tired, the particular flatness that comes from sustained effort and limited sleep. But there was something else in it that Meredith had seen before, in different circumstances, in people who had been through something they were still inside of. Not shock, not trauma in the clinical sense. Something quieter. A quality of having drawn a line between before and after and understanding that the line was permanent. Meredith had asked if she was hurt. Kay had said no. She had asked if there had been an incident requiring report. Kay had said she needed to think about how to describe it. Meredith had gotten her water and a sandwich from the break room refrigerator and had sat with her while she ate it and had not pushed. She had filed the administrative return notation that afternoon, early return, wellness basis, full debrief to follow, and had driven Kay to her car at the end of the day and watched her drive away and had gone home uncertain in a way that was unusual for her. Kay had been doing the back section patrol for 9 years. That was the context Meredith kept returning to in the 2 years since. 9 years. 8 previous 5-day patrols in the same sector, all completed on schedule, all resulting in thorough field notes and complete documentation. Kay was not a person who cut things short. She was not prone to the kind of exhaustion or anxiety that sent less experienced rangers out of the backcountry ahead of schedule. She was, in Meredith's assessment, one of the most self-sufficient field workers she had supervised in 20 years of service. The kind of person you sent to the back section precisely because the back section demanded that quality. The back section was what the district staff called it informally, in the way that field people develop informal names for places that have a character the official names don't capture. It appeared in internal documents as Sector 7R, which was administrative designation and said nothing about what it was. What it was the farthest reach of the park's backcountry. A day's hiking from the nearest road access. No communication relay, no fire tower, no maintained structure of any kind. The terrain was a mix of high-elevation spruce fir forest on the ridges and dense hardwood in the hollows, with several high-elevation wetland areas, marshes, and wet meadows that were ecologically significant enough to warrant monitoring. The patrol existed to check those monitoring points and to document any human access issues, illegal camping, boundary violations, that kind of thing. The back section had a quality that Meredith had noticed herself on the 2 occasions she had hiked into it for training purposes earlier in her career, before she moved into administrative work. It was the quality of distance from everything, taken further than it usually went. Most backcountry felt remote but connected. The sense that a road or a town was out there beyond the trees, even if you couldn't see or hear it. The back section did not feel that way. It felt like the park had a center and this was it, and the center was indifferent to what surrounded it. She had described it to a colleague once as the part of the park that the park seemed to want to keep. Her colleague had laughed, and she had laughed too, and they had moved on. She had not forgotten the description. Kay had done the first 2 days of the patrol without incident. Meredith knew this from the field notes, which were thorough and ordinary. Trail register checks, water quality readings at 3 monitoring points, documentation of a large white ash that had come down across a creek crossing and would need to be cut, notes on a beaver dam at the lower marsh that was affecting the drainage pattern in a way that would need to be assessed next season. The notes from those 2 days were Kay's standard field notes. Precise, organized, complete. The handwriting was even and consistent, the kind of handwriting that came from someone doing what they always did with the competence they always brought to it. The notes from the 3rd day were almost the same. Almost. The handwriting was the same, the organization was the same. The content was standard field documentation. But at the bottom of the 3rd day's entry, below the day's final note about weather conditions and camp setup, Kay had written a single line that she had not written at the bottom of any previous day's entry in any of the 9 years of back section patrols. She had written, "Something is doing rounds." That was all. No elaboration, no description, no indication of what she meant by rounds. The phrase was followed by the date and the time, 11:47 p.m., and then the notes ended and the next page began the 4th day's entry, which was where the handwriting changed. The 4th day's entry began normally. Kay had broken camp at first light, as was her habit on days when she had a monitoring point at distance. Earlier start, longer window, the discipline of experienced field workers who know that the backcountry does not negotiate with your schedule. The high-elevation marsh monitoring point was 2 miles from her camp at the farthest reach of the back section, a place she had visited 6 times across her 9 years of patrol, and which she had noted in previous years as one of the more striking locations in the sector. A wide, still expanse of open water and sedge grass at an elevation where the surrounding spruce fir forest opened up and the sky came down to meet the ground in a way that felt, as she had written in a previous year's notes, like being at the edge of something. Meredith had read that phrase in the old notes before Kay told her what happened, and it had stayed with her. The edge of something. Kay was not given to atmospheric writing. Her field notes were functional documents, precise and undecorated. That phrase was the only one of its kind in 9 years of Kay's back section reports, and it appeared in the notes from the marsh monitoring point. Kay had reached the point at mid-morning. The weather was clear, no wind. Meredith would later think about the no-wind detail more than almost anything else. Kay had set up her monitoring kit at the established sampling station. the small metal post with the temperature probe and the water quality sensor that the district had installed 3 years earlier. She had knelt at the station and begun logging the readings, working through the protocol she had worked through 6 times before, recording the numbers in her field notebook in the careful columns she always used. The 4th day's field notes showed the monitoring sequence beginning normally. Water temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, the first 3 readings logged in their columns, the numbers ordinary for the season and the elevation. The 4th reading, conductivity, was begun. The column header was written. The unit designation was written. The number itself was not there. The pen had stopped mid-entry, between the unit designation and where the number should have been, and the next mark on the page was not a number but a slight pressure mark, the kind that happened when a pen touched paper without moving, when a hand had stopped. Below that, nothing. The 4th day's entry ended there, in the middle of a conductivity reading at a marsh monitoring point on a clear morning with no wind. The next entry in the notebook was dated 3 days later at the trailhead. It read, "Early return. Full debrief to follow." Nothing else. No account of what had happened between the stopped conductivity reading and the trailhead entry. 3 days of time and 9 miles of hiking with no field notes, which in 9 years of Kay's records had never happened. Kay documented everything. She documented weather changes and animal sightings and the quality of creek crossings and the condition of trail markers. She had never left 3 days blank. For 6 months, Kay did not explain it. She went on administrative leave, came back on a reduced schedule, worked in the office, filed paperwork, answered phones. She was professional and reliable in the office work the way she had always been professional and reliable in the field. She did not discuss the patrol. Meredith did not push. She had learned over 20 years that pushing people toward accounts they weren't ready to give produced accounts that were shaped by the push rather than the experience, and shaped accounts were less useful than waited for ones. Kay came to her on a Tuesday evening in late winter, after the office had cleared out. She sat down across from Meredith's desk the same way she had sat in the break room 6 months earlier, with the same quality of having drawn a line between before and after. She said she was ready to describe it, and she would like Meredith to write it down as she told it, because she did not think she could write it herself. Meredith had taken out a fresh notebook, not a district form, not an official document, just a lined notebook from her desk drawer, and she had written the date at the top of the first page and said she was ready. Kay described the 3rd night first. The circling. She had heard it beginning around midnight, a sound in the camp perimeter that she had first categorized as large mammal, bear, possibly, doing the smell circuit that bears do around human camps, moving in a wide arc and returning. She had camped in the back section 8 times and had bear activity on 2 of those occasions, and she knew what a bear's perimeter circuit sounded like. This was similar but not identical. The gait was wrong. Bears move at a shuffle on level ground, a specific rhythm she knew well. This moved differently, more deliberate, more evenly paced, the footfall intervals too consistent, like something that was counting its steps. She had lain in her tent and tracked it by sound for 2 hours. The circuit took approximately 40 minutes to complete. It did not vary, not by much, not in the way an animal's circuit varied as it moved between areas of interest. It came around with the regularity of something that was not investigating but patrolling. After 2 hours, it stopped. She did not hear it leave. It was there, and then it was not there, the silence arriving without the transition of fading footsteps or brush movement. She had lain awake until dawn. In the morning, she had checked the perimeter. The ground was soft, the kind of soft that her own boots sank into, leaving clear prints. She found her own prints from the previous evening, going about the camp tasks she'd done before turning in. She found nothing else. Whatever had circled her tent for 2 hours on soft ground in the dark had left no mark on it. She had made a professional decision to continue the patrol. She documented the night's activity as a possible large mammal. She had written it, and then added the word possible, and then stopped, because the word possible was doing more work than it could hold, but she had no other word, and so she left it. She broke camp, hiked the 2 miles to the marsh monitoring point, set up her kit, began the readings. She told Meredith that she had been on the 3rd reading when she became aware that something about the tree line across the marsh was wrong. She used that word, wrong, and Meredith wrote it down and asked her to describe what she meant by wrong. Kay said it was not a visual thing she could point to, not a shape or a movement. It was the kind of wrongness that registered below the level of vision, the way a room registers as wrong before you identify which object has moved. She stood at the monitoring station and looked at the tree line and could not identify what was wrong with it. The trees were the trees, the spruce fir at the marsh edge that she had looked at 6 times before. They were standing where they had always stood, but the shadows were not moving. It was a clear morning with no wind, and the shadows at the base of the tree line were not tracking with the sun the way shadows track on a clear morning. They were still, not slightly still, not the stillness of very light conditions, fully still, as if the light were not moving across them, as if they were shadows in a photograph rather than shadows on the ground. She had stood at the monitoring station and looked at this for several minutes before she understood what she was looking at. She was still understanding it when the tree line spoke her name. Not Kay. Meredith knew Kay's given name, but had never used it in field documentation, and she did not use it here because Kay had asked her not to. Her full given name, the name on her Park Service identification card, the name her mother used when she called, the name that did not appear on any trail register or permit or field document she had ever submitted for the back section, a name that existed in the district's human resources records and nowhere in the backcountry. The voice that said it was coming from the tree line across the marsh, not close, not far, the distance of a person calling across water, the distance of someone who wanted to be heard without being reached. The voice was not speaking to her the way a threat speaks. It was speaking the way a person speaks when they are trying to get the attention of someone they know, gently, across a space, not wanting to startle. It said her name once, a single utterance, careful and specific, at a distance. She did not answer. She did not move for a time she estimated as several minutes, but which she understood might have been shorter or longer, because the marsh had taken on the quality of a place where time was not moving at its normal rate. The monitoring kit was open in front of her. The pen was in her hand. The conductivity reading was half-logged in the column. She was aware of all of those things, and she did not move. Then her name again, from a different direction. She told Meredith this was the part that had taken her 6 months to be able to say. Not the first voice, the second one, because the second voice was closer, not across the marsh, not at the distance of someone calling, but at the distance of someone nearby, just into the tree line on her side of the marsh, perhaps 20 feet behind and to her left. And the second voice was not the same as the first voice. It was a different voice, a different register, a different quality, the same name but spoken by a different source. 2 voices, 2 directions, her name, twice, from positions that were not moving toward her. She turned and walked away from the monitoring station. Not running. She told Meredith she had made a specific decision not to run, that something about running felt like a response she did not want to give, like an answer to a question she did not want to answer. She walked. She walked at a pace that was faster than her normal field pace, but not running, and she did not look back. and she walked the 2 miles to camp and struck the tent and packed her kit, and walked the 9 miles to the trailhead and got in her truck. The field notes ended at the conductivity reading. She had not written anything after that point. Not at camp, not on the trail out, not at the trailhead. She had not been able to find the right column for what had happened, and so she had left it in the wrong place, which was the blank space after a number that was never recorded. Meredith wrote it all down. She wrote it in the lined notebook, and when Kay finished, she sat for a moment, and then she asked if she could take the notebook home. Kay said yes, and Meredith put it in her bag and drove home and put it on her desk, and it had been there since. She filed Kay's return as wellness-related, which was the vocabulary of incomplete explanations, which was the best language she had. Kay went on leave and did not return to fieldwork. The back section patrol was suspended the following season, budget reallocation, and when it resumed it was pairs only. No documented reason for the change, nobody in the district asking. Kay moved away before the suspension was lifted. Meredith heard through mutual contacts that she was somewhere on the West Coast. Administrative work. Indoors, far from any district she'd ever patrolled. Douglas had told Kay 3 years before it happened. Douglas was a retired fire warden who had worked the back section before it was incorporated into the park system, who had known that terrain for decades before Kay's first patrol of it. He had told her at a trail crew event offhand, the kind of thing you say because you know it matters even if you can't explain why it matters. Don't go to the marsh on a clear morning when there's no wind. The still days are when it's paying attention. Kay had heard it as the kind of thing old mountain workers said, practical sounding, rooted in something real that had been translated into habit and then into speech and then into the kind of warning that meant something once and now meant the shape of the thing without the content. She had not changed her patrol schedule. Douglas had known. He had known before Kay's first patrol, before Kay had a name that anything in the back section could have learned, which meant it had been paying attention before Kay, had been learning names before Kay's name was there to learn, had been waiting on still mornings at the marsh for longer than 9 years, longer than Kay's tenure, longer perhaps than the Park Service's authority over that land. Meredith did not know what to do with that. She had written it in the lined notebook and looked at it and not known. She submitted the account herself, 2 years after Kay told her, through the closed network. She submitted it because she had been carrying it alone, and because she was close to retirement, and because she believed, in the way she believed practical things, that accounts should exist somewhere outside one person's desk. She added a note at the end that said, "Someone should know that in the back section, on a still morning, something has learned the names of the people who come there, and it does not need to approach you to let you know that it knows." She retired the following spring. She took the notebook with her. It is on her desk at home, in the corner, beside her coffee mug and her reading glasses. She is aware of it the way you are aware of something that has no right to take up as much space as it does. The back section is still there. The marsh is still there. The patrol runs in pairs now, and nobody who does it has submitted anything unusual through the network, and the district has not changed the pair's requirement or explained it. On still mornings when there is no wind, the shadows at the marsh tree line do not move with the light. Meredith knows this because Kay told her, and because Douglas knew it before Kay, which means someone knew it before Douglas, and the line goes back further than any record she has found. She has looked. She has not found the beginning of it. She is not certain the beginning exists in any document she would be able to read. Kay has not been back. She does not talk about it. She is somewhere on the West Coast, in a building, doing work that does not require her to be alone in places where the still days are the dangerous ones. Her name was said twice on a clear morning with no wind. 2 voices, 2 directions, neither moving toward her. She did not answer.